a popular and fun-loving college student.
Mindy was a very bubbly person. She's always seemed to be happy. She had a light in her eyes, and she accepted everyone.
Is found savagely murdered in her apartment.
There was a belt wrapped around her neck and appeared to be a broken-off knife still stuck in her throat.
Police need to determine, was this a sinister obsession?
Mindy, I know what happened to you. God picked the beautiful flower.
He had called and left numerous messages on her cell phone.
Just really a strange type of relationship.
A crucial piece of evidence.
There was some material under the fingernails of her left hand.
I know you got a mark on your hand. How did you get that?
Shines a light on a dangerous predator no one saw coming.
I was very shocked. I think everybody was.
He was not the man we thought he was.
I don't think I would ever expect that outcome at all.
Hey Mindy, it's Danny. Anyway, you can just give me a call back. Okay, bye. Hey Mindy, it's Tony. Hey, Jamie's trying to get over to you. Bye. Where are you? Okay, bye.
I remember trying to call Mindy a few times and she wasn't answering. So me and my friend Danielle drove and parked in front of her apartment across the street. I ran inside. I knocked on the door and there was no answer, and it wasn't locked. And so I opened the door and I stepped in, and about 2 steps in, I saw something on the ground right in front of my feet. It was Mindy. And then I noticed something around her neck.
Horrified, Mindy's friend rushes outside to call 911.
About 10 minutes before 9 o'clock at night, dispatch called me at my house and said that they've got a hysterical caller on the phone. I got the address and it was 1 block from my house. When I arrived, both Danielle and Tony were very distraught, very upset.
The apartment was located on the 2nd floor of the building. As I entered, I could smell a very strong odor like an ammonia disinfectant. The body of the victim was laying across the entry hallway.
And it appeared her throat had been half cut open.
Detectives begin their investigation and identify the victim as 22-year-old college senior Mindy Morgenstern.
I knew Mindy. She was a student at the college. I'd seen her at a lot of their events. And to see that it was her, I was really surprised and quite shocked.
There was a belt wrapped around her neck and appeared to be a broken-off knife still stuck in her throat.
It appeared that the belt was applied to the neck prior to the neck being cut.
Investigators find an empty bottle of disinfectant beside the body.
Somebody had poured the disinfectant over her body, possibly trying to destroy any type of evidence.
killer tried to cover their tracks, but investigators find something they missed.
There was some material under the fingernails of her left hand where possibly Mindy had scratched her assailant.
We felt that this was going to be a DNA forensic type case based on materials that were found on Mindy's fingernails.
And to preserve that, the hands are placed in bags for autopsy. She had a purse around her right arm. Her wallet was laying just outside of the purse.
It didn't appear that they'd been gone through or anything removed from them. There was clean laundry around the body and a laundry basket. It almost appeared as if she was attacked as she was going in the door with that laundry. It did not look like the apartment had been ransacked or gone through, so it didn't appear that theft was a motive in this killing.
There was no sign of any forced entry into the apartment.
It told us that the person was either in her apartment or followed her in.
Her cell phone was located, and the first missed call on that phone was at 12:47 p.m. on September 13th. That gave us some indication as to what time the attack may have occurred.
By 10 p.m., more than 9 hours after the first missed call, detectives have little to go on as they work into the night at the crime scene.
When we first left the scene the following morning, we had no clear indication of who may have done this.
Police reach Mindy's sister to inform her of the murder, and she delivers the tragic news to her parents.
The front doorbell rang. And I said, "Who's there?" And Rebecca, our daughter, she said, "It's me, Dad. We've got some bad news."
And then Rebecca said to me that, "Mom, Mindy is dead." It was just like somebody taking a knife and just sticking it right into your heart. I just wanted to try to just say, no, this isn't real, this didn't happen. I didn't want it to be true. She had such a loving, loving heart, and I loved her very much.
Born in Bogota, Colombia on April 29, 1984, Mindy was adopted as a baby by Valley City farmers Larry and Eunice Morgenstern.
The first time I saw Mindy, she had the biggest, darkest, most beautiful eyes that I had ever seen.
It was pretty amazing to see this little character in the basket that she brought home to be part of our family.
Mindy was the youngest of 4 Morgenstern children, 3 of them adopted by Larry and Eunice.
Mindy was very much a tomboy. And as she grew up, she got so beautiful. She didn't really realize that she would be looked upon as somebody that would turn boys' heads.
After high school, Mindy moved to Valley City and dove headlong into college life.
She just seemed to enjoy all the friends that she had there.
Mindy was a very friendly, outgoing, bubbly person. She just always seemed to be happy.
She had a light in her eyes, and she accepted everyone.
Mindy's future was looking bright until the stunning attack that cut her down in her prime.
It was very difficult to see Mindy's body in the condition that it was in when we found her. I want to find out who did this, because she was loved by a lot of people in our community.
Back at the crime scene, Mindy's two friends tell detectives they weren't the only ones to see Mindy's body.
When Tony found Mindy at the scene, she screamed, which alerted a man in a neighboring apartment to come out to see what was wrong.
He was there when I first entered the apartment complex, and they showed me where Mindy was located.
He told investigators that he checked for a pulse using the back of his hand to not leave any fingerprints on the victim.
It was a little odd because people don't describe things like that, like using the back of their hand so they don't leave fingerprints and things like that.
If he was there to help, I couldn't understand why he'd be worried about something like that.
Police identify the man as Robert Linz and soon notice a telling detail about him.
He had scratches on his hands that would correspond to someone trying to get your hands off of them when they were being attacked.
Had Mindy scratched Robert as she fought for her life?
Robert Linz, having those scratches, being in the same building, he certainly needed to be looked at.
A lot of times, a person at the crime scene is a person that committed the crime. And if any evidence of them is found, they have an excuse for saying why it was there.
Coming up, detectives uncover a world of secrets.
She reminded me so much of my wife in her younger days. It's like, I don't want you talking to her this time of year.
It turned out upon checking his background that he had a felony record.
And as they zero in on a killer,
I was absolutely certain we had the right guy.
a stunning setback turns the case on its head.
I just thought, oh, it's all over with now. They're going to let him go.
This case was a shock to everybody.
When we found out who the person was, it was just, wow.
Police investigating the murder of 22-year-old college student Mindy Morgenstern have just identified their first suspect, her neighbor, Robert Linz.
When officers met Robert Linz, they noticed some scratches on his hands.
And he also used the back of his hand to see if she was deceased or not. His concern was he didn't want to leave any fingerprints or DNA in the apartment because he had nothing to do with the incident.
Suspicions aroused. Police bring Robert Linz into the station for an interview.
Could you before? I knew her in passing, seen her every day.
All he knew about her is that she was a pretty girl and that she lived in the apartment building.
When investigators dig into Robert's history, they find something troubling.
It turned out upon checking his background that he had a felony record.
I apologize. He was stolen car, had a gun. My original sentence was 2 years and 8 months.
Robert Linz was in the criminal system out in California. He's street smart, and he knew not to leave fingerprints at a crime scene.
Detectives ask Robert how he got the scratches on his hands.
All your hands are really cut out and stuff. Is that normal from work?
Yeah, this is an everyday thing.
Having steel and stuff.
Yeah, all day long, steel. I get cut pretty bad. Constantly.
He claimed he worked at a place where they built steel buildings and stuff like that, and he got the bruises on his hands from his job.
Police cut to the chase and ask Robert where he was on the day Mindy was murdered.
No, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was a regular day where...
What time did you start?
I'm there like 5 minutes to 7.
Robert Linz told investigators that he had been at work that day from 7 in the morning, and he didn't arrive home to his apartment until about 5:30.
We talked to his employer. He did work all day. He did work with steel, so it's very easy for him to cut his hands. So there was really nothing to put him at that apartment at the time the crime occurred.
Still, police aren't ready to rule out Robert just yet.
We asked him to provide DNA sample, which he agreed to.
While they await DNA test results, police canvass Mindy's neighbors.
We were looking for anybody that might have seen something, heard something, so we can get a better timeline as far as when this might have happened.
While going door to door, investigators are pleased to see a familiar face.
As I was collecting statements outside, I saw Mo Gibbs.
He had been living in the apartment building with his wife and stepdaughter.
Mo works at the Barnes County Jail, and due to the fact that he was a correctional officer, I would run into him quite often while he was working. And I also knew Mo because we played on the co-ed softball tournament together.
The guy in his position probably would be an excellent witness if he had seen or heard anything.
Mo Gibbs said that he knew Mindy as a person that lived in the building. He had seen her come and go.
The investigator asks Mo if he noticed anything unusual that afternoon.
Mo had said that he went with his wife and stepdaughter for lunch, then came back to the apartment at about 12:45 and started packing and loading boxes as he and his wife were going to be moving out of the apartment.
He mentioned that when he went into the apartment complex, he could smell a strong, distinct odor of a disinfectant.
Other than that, he claimed that he didn't hear or see anything.
So we were working with a timeline between the first missed call at 12:47 p.m. and the disinfectant being smelled shortly after 1 o'clock p.m.
So we figured she probably was deceased prior to 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
To rule them out, police collect DNA samples from Mo and the other building residents.
All the DNA samples taken during our interviews were sent to the state crime lab.
In search of new leads, detectives turn to Mindy's loved ones.
I just didn't think there was anybody that would want to do anything like that to her.
Investigators push Mindy's parents to think hard about anyone who might have had a problem with her.
Mindy's mother mentioned that Tony had had this boyfriend that wasn't such a nice person. His name was James.
I was dating James Robinson at the time, and he was doing some bad things, and I was taking the brunt of it, and Mindy didn't really care for him because she had known that there was times that it got pretty scary.
Mindy did bring him up at one time, something about him being on drugs or something.
Mindy was trying to get Tony to quit seeing James, and that may give him some reason to hold a grudge against Mindy.
This James Robinson didn't look like he wanted his girlfriend, Tony, to be friends with Mindy.
She did, obviously like a friend does, get out. You need to leave. He's not a good guy. This isn't a good relationship.
In trying to help her friend, had Mindy made a deadly enemy.
Seemed like the attack was personal in nature. It made me think that maybe this guy had something to do with her death.
Investigators are hunting for the killer of popular college student Mindy Morgenstern. They now suspect James Robinson, who may have held a grudge against Mindy for trying to turn his girlfriend Tony against him.
So James was called in to do an interview to see what we could glean from him.
Did you know Mindy pretty well? I knew her from going to visit Tony at work, and she'd be there or whatever, and we'd get together every once in a while and go out to the theater.
Police ask James if he has a criminal record.
James said that he had, in the past, had trouble with illegal drugs. He had been charged, but he was trying to stay out of that lifestyle.
As James talks, detectives notice suspicious cuts on his hands.
Shoot your hand. You got it. Yeah, it went right through a window. Blood like something here. It looks pretty fresh.
Police press James on his whereabouts at the time of the murder.
What were you doing during the day? I know I had 4 hours of community service left to do.
James told investigators that he went to do community service from these previous charges. He then went to a friend's house and went back home sometime 5 o'clock or later. We checked, and it was verified that he had been at those locations that day.
Even though James's alibi checks out, investigators collect a DNA sample in order to officially rule him out. As they review evidence from the crime scene, autopsy results arrive.
The autopsy of Mindy's body indicated that she had died from asphyxiation and due to the cuts to her neck. There was no indication that Mindy had been sexually assaulted.
Still awaiting results on DNA collected from Mindy's fingernails, detectives turn to her coworkers for new leads.
Mindy had been working at a restaurant in Valley City as a waitstaff. It was important to interview Mindy's coworkers and see if they knew of anyone unusual in the restaurant that stood out to them. There was a man that lived in a motor home across the street from the restaurant.
Mindy told coworkers that he made her feel really uneasy, and he was always in there bothering them. So, hearing that information, we decided to interview him.
What's your full name?
Ralph Albert Walter.
So how long have you been in Valley City?
Well, I don't know. You could say I'm a drifter, but,
Mr. Walters didn't have any ties to the area, just kind of an odd character.
You remember anything particular you did on Wednesday?
Oh, that was the day that could change the oil in the motorhome.
He really didn't have a good alibi for when Mindy was murdered.
Just as with previous suspects, detectives spot a potentially damning clue.
I know you got a mark on your hand. How did you get that?
When I put that oil filter on.
Have you had any type of altercation or disagreements in any of the restaurants with anybody?
I can't think of any.
He claimed he never bothered anybody in the restaurant where Mindy worked. Claimed he didn't know who she was.
But Mindy's coworkers tell a different story.
They all said that he was in there quite often.
Mr. Walters would have seen her coming and going at least. Would that give him a reason to follow her? We really didn't know at that point.
Red flags were waving, of course, but I was real careful not to jump to any conclusions too early on in the investigation.
Detectives collect Ralph's DNA and let him go, but they're not ready to clear him just yet.
We keep him on the list. We're hoping DNA samples, if he was involved, would eventually tie him into it.
2 days after the murder, the wait for answers starts to take a toll on Mindy's family.
That was the hard part. Not knowing what was going on and what happened and why.
It was like living someplace in another world, and you just wanted answers.
3 days into the investigation, detectives catch a break when they find disturbing voicemails left on Mindy's phone after she was dead.
You know my number, sweetie. I miss you. I love you. You're my inspiration. Please help me. Please help me, baby. I can't continue without you. Please help me. Some way, help me.
Detectives search the number and discover that it belongs to a man named Rodney Kuznia.
After Mindy had passed away, he had called and left numerous messages on her cell phone.
Investigators rush to find out who Rodney Kuznia is and why he called Mindy after her murder.
Mindy's friends had told us about a previous boyfriend by the name of Kyle Kuznia. They had been very serious and they had broken up the prior year. Mindy's phone indicated a lot of calls between she and Kyle's father, Rodney.
We thought this was really odd because why would an ex-boyfriend's father be so interested in Mindy?
There was some indication from Mindy's friends that Mindy had told Rodney to quit calling her.
It's been 3 days since 22-year-old Mindy Morgenstern was found brutally murdered in her apartment. Police have a new suspect, an ex-boyfriend's father who left suspicious voicemails for Mindy after her death.
Mindy, this is Rod. I know what happened to you. Please don't hear your voice. Can't take it. I love you, kid. God makes a beautiful flower. I'm sorry that happened that way. It happened to you.
It just was really odd why Mindy's ex-boyfriend's father was leaving these messages, why he was so infatuated with her, and obviously he had feelings for her.
Eager to learn more about Mindy's communication with Rodney, detectives start by questioning his son, Kyle.
Kyle was Mindy's ex-boyfriend, and Mindy, I think, still had feelings for Kyle.
It was found that Kyle had broken off his relationship with her a year before and was planning to get married to someone else, and had really had very little contact with Mindy since that time that they had broken up.
I feel a little bad. Maybe I could have handled it a little different.
Have you had any other contact with her?
No, that was the last time I ever talked to her. I know she would kind of get information kind of through my dad. Him and her would continue to talk.
After verifying that Kyle was working out of town on the day of the murder, detectives turn their questions to his father's relationship with Mindy.
It's like, I don't want you talking to her. 10, 20 years down the road, you guys are still going to be talking, and it's kind of weird.
It is kind of weird.
Yeah.
It was actually ruining his relationship with his father because Rodney was so involved with Mindy still.
I even asked my dad, because I would appreciate it if you guys would stop talking.
Rod Kuznia had an almost unhealthy amount of contact with Mindy, and then that continued even after Kyle and Mindy broke up.
The calls were very frequent, like multiple times daily, and it really made us wonder, did Mindy want him to quit calling her? Did that make him angry?
Detectives bring Rodney Kuznia in for an interview.
He was at least in his 50s, and we weren't sure what it was that he wanted out of Mindy.
You and Mindy became, you call it, friends. She dated your son.
Correct.
I don't understand the relationship.
Well, you'd have to know Mindy. She was quite the bubbly character. She reminded me so much of my wife in her younger days.
Detectives press Rodney about the messages he left after hearing of Mindy's death.
I did call after I heard the fact and left a message. I know it's really stupid to do that, but I wanted her to pick up and have. What did you tell her? Oh my God, take the perfect flower.
It was just really a strange type of relationship between a man that was her boyfriend's father and her.
Detectives press Rodney on his whereabouts at the time of the murder.
Rod Kuznia indicated that he was working on his farm with his two sons from 7 in the morning till early in the evening.
We checked and verified that, yes, he had been at work that day.
Detectives collect DNA from Rodney, but with nothing concrete against him, they must let him go.
We still thought that it was such an odd relationship that we certainly wouldn't close the book on looking at Rodney any further.
The pressure to find Mindy's killer only increases as the community becomes gripped by fear.
It was super scary because you didn't know who it was. It could have been anybody. You were scared to go out by yourself. You were scared to do anything. It wasn't safe Little Valley City anymore.
6 days after the murder, Mindy's funeral draws hundreds of mourners.
We had the funeral at the high school gym because we didn't think everybody could fit into the church. Well, there was over 500 people at the funeral. The police told us they would have some undercover agents watching because they didn't know for sure if this person was, after her or after us. And you get kind of paranoid of anything like that happening until they finally catch the right person.
The day after Mindy's funeral, investigators receive surprising news from the crime lab.
The state crime lab called and said that we have a positive match of the DNA.
The DNA extracted from under the fingernails of Mindy matched an unsolved brutal sexual assault in Fargo 2 years previously.
And when we found out who the person was, it was just kind of silence. Then there was a shock.
One week after the murder of 22-year-old Mindy Morgenstern, detectives received DNA test results that turn the case on its head.
The DNA from every one of the suspects, Kuznia, Walters, Lind, and the others, all came back as not a match to the DNA found under Mindy's fingernails.
I asked, "Who is it?" They told me it was Mo Gibbs.
When they got the match, it was just, wow.
The DNA match of Mo Gibbs was really unexpected for us.
I knew him personally. He was a correctional officer, and it really caught me off guard that somebody in the law enforcement community would have done something like this.
When detectives look deep into Mo's background, they discover a hidden past.
Mo Gibbs was not the man we thought he was. When we started digging into his background, we had found out that he'd actually changed his name. We found out that he was involved in a drive-by shooting, and he had served 5 years in prison.
Also, his DNA matched this reported rape in Fargo from 2 years previously.
Given Mo's violent criminal past, detectives come up with a strategy to lure him into the station.
We had called Mo and asked him if he would be willing to come in, just to eliminate him as a suspect.
We're playing on his friendship with law enforcement. The idea was to get him in, lock him into a story, and then immediately give him the polygraph.
Mo Gibbs lived in the apartment building that Mindy lived in, and he said that he had seen her around, but he really didn't know her at all. Mo said that he had worked at the jail the previous night, had gotten home about 7 in the morning, and then he started packing and loading boxes out of the apartment.
Anything unusual that you noticed in the apartment building?
Nope. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary the whole day. I was back and forth.
Scratches were observed on Mo's hands, and Mo stated that he got those scratches from moving boxes. The polygraph operator asked him if he'd ever been in Mindy's room or in her apartment.
I went to her place one time, and that was probably either a week and a half or 2 weeks ago.
He stated that she was trying to carry a laundry basket and some other things all at the same time, and he assisted her in carrying that laundry to her apartment.
I'm thinking that he wanted to have an excuse for having evidence in that apartment.
With Mo's story in place, the polygraph can begin.
Regarding Mindy's death, do you intend to truthfully answer those questions?
Yes.
Did you injure Mindy and cause her death?
No.
At the conclusion of the polygraph examination, the examiner felt that there was some indication of deception.
There's a little bit of indication there that something is bothering you about this, and I guess I just want to try and get it resolved.
I mean, I don't know nothing about it. I mean, as far as anything else, I wasn't there, so it's not bothering me that I know. I mean, because I know I wasn't there.
Okay. What do you know about DNA?
Nothing.
Nothing? How would you feel if I told you that your DNA matches DNA that we found on Mindy's body?
I'd be like, that wasn't true, so I know I wasn't there, so.
At that point, we didn't think that he was really going to ever admit to anything, at least that day.
We're in a bind here. Your DNA is matching what we found on her, under her fingernails.
I don't know how my DNA was under her fingernail.
When we get DNA back, though, and it says, this is the person that it matches, this person out of so many million, we can't argue with that, Mo. Plus, I'm going to let you in on something else here. The DNA that they brought up, it also matches the DNA that was found on a girl that was sexually assaulted 2 years ago in Fargo.
Okay.
He was arrested immediately after that interview and charged with murder.
Could you stand up, please, and put your hand behind your back? We have an arrest warrant for the murder of Mindy Morgenstern.
News of Mo's arrest opens a floodgate of shocking accusations.
A number of female inmates in the jail where Mo Gibbs worked came forward and said he's been doing sexual stuff to us in the jail for weeks or months.
Mo is charged with 6 felonies for the sexual assaults and 1 count of first-degree murder.
It was a very, very much a shock when they revealed who was arrested.
I was very surprised and very shocked due to the fact I knew him personally, but it was a great feeling to get the person who had done this horrific crime.
We went to trial in Minot, North Dakota, provided evidence to the jury there about the DNA under her fingernails, the scratches on his hand.
Despite the evidence against him, Mo's lawyers mount a strong defense.
Their argument was the DNA found in Mindy's fingernails was probably touch DNA that she got from doorknobs that Mo Gibbs had been touching.
I went into the jury deliberations believing strongly that we'd proved our case beyond a reasonable doubt.
On July 12, 2007, the jury returns to the courtroom with news that takes everyone by surprise.
The jury deliberated for a fair period of time and came back as a hung jury and could not reach a decision.
We were so sure he was gonna go down, but they just got him off. You kind of went home and you were thinking, what are we gonna do now?
Corrections Officer Mo Gibbs has just been tried for the murder of 22-year-old Mindy Morgenstern. But when the verdict comes back, a hung jury, Mindy's loved ones are left fearing the worst.
I was very shocked. I think everybody was. I don't think I would ever expect that outcome at all.
When we heard it was a hung jury, I just thought, oh, it's all over with now. They're going to let him go.
Was it possible that Mo had not killed Mindy after all? Or was a murderer about to go free?
When a hung jury like that happens, it's extremely disappointing and hard to understand for people because it's just a temporary setback.
I was absolutely certain we had the right guy.
In the Minot trial, the defense, the one thing they really hung their hat on was that trying to say it was just touch DNA.
We felt it was obvious that to get DNA under your fingernails, it wasn't from touching any kind of doorknob.
So we wanted to totally rule that out, and we're able to find another expert to help us do that.
On October 22nd, 2007, more than a year after Mindy's murder, Mo Gibbs goes on trial for the second time.
The expert described this as a vigorous assault. The amount of DNA was not from touching a doorknob or a laundry basket.
The prosecution lays out further evidence, carefully building the case against Mo.
Mo Gibbs' phone was seized after his arrest. There were never times when he went for an hour or more that he was not texting or doing something with his phone.
He got off at 7 in the morning from his shift, and he was continually either emailing or texting people until he had to go pick up his fiancée to go to lunch. He dropped her back off around 12:30 or 1 o'clock, and that's when we believe he came back to the apartment building. Mindy's last missed call was at 12:47 that day, and for the next 2 hours, Mo Gibbs was doing something else other than sending texts or sending emails.
With DNA and other evidence placing Mo at the scene, the prosecution lays out their theory of the murder.
I believe that Mindy was carrying clothes into her apartment, and Mo Gibbs was in the hallway and got her in there and pushed her on the floor and attempted to rape her.
I think Mindy fought back, and things went drastically wrong.
I think what happened was he tried strangling her with a belt. It wasn't going as he wanted it to. She wasn't dying fast enough. So he got a knife and he stabbed her. And then when he got done, he finds a cleaning solution, dumps it on her body. And then he gets the heck out of there.
Then he starts back with the texting and emailing and went on with his life.
As Mo's second murder trial concludes, prosecutors have one final card to play.
There was a cellmate of Mo Gibbs while he was awaiting trial that had told investigators that Mo had admitted to killing Mindy.
Gibbs had told them that he'd done it. He'd do it again if he had the opportunity.
As the jury deliberates for a second time, Mindy's loved ones nervously await the outcome.
And I was wondering, what's going on? I wanted to know things. I wanted to hear what was coming out of their mouths.
On November 16th, 2007, after deliberating for over 27 hours, the jury returns with the verdict.
We, the jury, do find the defendant, Mo M. Gibbs, guilty of the crime of murder.
For killing Mindy Morgenstern, Mo Gibbs is sentenced to life without parole.
He got a 12-year sentence on the unsolved rape and 15 years on the jail sexual assaults that had happened.
It was a relief that they finally caught the person and he wasn't going to be out there to do it to somebody else again.
The fact that Mo Gibbs is going to be in prison, it was finally over with. We could finally go on and just try to get through life the rest of the time that we had.
Mo got what he deserved. Because of Mindy's actions and her strength, we were able to get the DNA that we needed, and that DNA helped us solve this case.
Though justice is served, nothing can dull the pain of Mindy's loss.
Oh, I miss Mindy so much every day.
You never get over it, but you go on and you pray for that time when you can see her again up there in the heavens. That's where I know where she's at.
I like to remember her smile. I have a picture of her on my refrigerator, and the light just radiates from her face. And she's so happy. And that's the way I like to remember her.
A vibrant young woman with a bright future.
She just was like a magnet. She was very, very pretty, but also very smart.
Is the victim of a truly disturbing murder.
He'd been struck on the head many times.
It's kind of the horror story.
The body itself appeared to have been washed. Jewelry had been put on her after the fact.
She had been staged for this suspect's desires. Who could have done this? Could it be somebody who likes her, somebody who has a fantasy over her?
Detectives hunt for a deranged killer.
We noticed bloodied palm print.
Police had collected about 100 different print impressions.
We could be looking for a serial killer.
Just when it looks like justice may never be served.
It was extremely frustrating.
A stunning discovery points to a murderer in their midst.
When we found out who it was like, are you kidding? Nobody could believe it.
Less than an hour outside Los Angeles, Irvine, California is a peaceful community with a coastal vibe.
Irvine is very, very pretty. It is pretty much the hub of Orange County. The ocean's only 10 minutes away, and this is where everybody wanted to be.
Irvine has always been considered to be a very safe city and has not been known for violence.
On May 14th, 1979, Irvine's sense of safety is shattered when a man calls 911 to say he can't get a hold of his 22-year-old girlfriend, Savannah Anderson.
Earlier that day, her boyfriend went over to her residence to meet her at about 6 o'clock. He couldn't get any response at the door.
He went back home for a while, couldn't get a hold of her still.
He called the police department about 7:25 p.m. It was a welfare check. Her boyfriend indicated that she had not been feeling well, and so there was a concern that it could be a health issue. When the officer arrived, he met her boyfriend, Bill Mills, and another man, Ken Bergensen, who identified himself as her boss.
They explained they'd both come to the apartment to try to find out if she was okay because nobody'd been able to get a hold of her that day.
I was very fortunate to work with Savannah. Savannah was always prompt, and she didn't come that day. All day long, it was like trying to get a hold of her, no answers. By the end of the day, we were very concerned. Something might have happened because that wasn't like her.
The officer found the apartment was in fact locked up tight. There was no key available from the apartment office. The officer found out that a bedroom window nearby was unlocked from the inside, and he was able to open that bedroom window.
When the officer made entry, he was able to see a woman with a lot of blood around her, lying in bed, towels wrapped around her face and head. She was cold to the touch.
Both Savannah's boyfriend and boss are taken to the station for questioning, while homicide investigators are called to the scene.
When I walked in, it appeared to me that there was a struggle, a fight, and it was very clear that she was attacked on the bed, and she laid on the bed for some time due to the amount of blood that had pooled in that area. A lot of blood splattering against the back of the wall of the headboard.
She also had towels over her face. After the towels were taken off, her face was found out to be beaten very severely, excessively.
The towels were significant It tells you that the killer may have known her and didn't want to look at what they've done.
It appeared that the body of the victim had been beaten with something hard.
She had multiple defensive marks on her arms, her hands, nail marks around the neck area, which would indicate that she also had a ligature that had been placed around her neck.
The legs were slightly raised as if some sexual activity may have occurred there.
Perhaps she was the victim of a sexual assault.
The degree of violence to Savannah's body was unusual. Did somebody do it because they were angry at her? If they were angry at her, is that because they knew her, they loved her, they hated her?
Based on the state of the body, police believe Savannah was likely killed in the early hours of the morning. Looking closer, several details strike investigators as highly unusual.
Savannah had some jewelry on her. There was a necklace around her neck, and the clasp was at the front. There was also a watch on her arm that looked like it had just been put on there loosely.
We were surprised to see that those items were still intact on her based upon the brutality of her attacker. So it appeared that he may have just put those items back on her.
The body itself appeared to have been washed, as there's very little blood on the skin surface of the victim.
We noticed drag marks from the bed onto the carpet leading into the bathroom. Inside the bathroom, there was diluted blood with water around the sink area and also the bathtub.
She looked like she had been cleaned up and set in a particular position on the bed that was staged for this suspect's desires. And I think that was important to get an idea of what this type of person was willing to do to Savannah's body, put things on her, put clothes on her, whatever.
It was very unusual for any type of murder, in my opinion. It looks like somebody wanted to make it look like she was fine and nothing was wrong.
Police find some important clues the killer left behind.
We noticed bloodied palm print leading from the bedroom into the bathroom. Palm prints are identifiable just like fingerprints. There were smudged, bloodied fingerprints on the toilet seat.
They were basically the only way that we'd be able to find out who the killer might have been. There was no DNA at the time.
Detectives find no murder weapon or any sign of forced entry.
We made the determination that the killer may have been known by Savannah and let him in through the front door. Another theory was through an unlocked open window.
After finishing up at the scene, detectives break the news of Savannah's death to her loved ones.
The parents lived in Utah. When I spoke to Savannah's mother on the phone, she was devastated by this. It was her only child. It's probably hard for most people to realize, first of all, what it's like to lose a child, let alone the only child you have. Savannah's mother said Savannah had made a collect call to her about 10 o'clock the previous day on Mother's Day evening. They had talked on the phone for about 2 hours. Savannah was very happy, good mood. That must have made it even more so difficult.
When I found out what had happened to Savannah, we were all totally shocked. My heart just hurt so much. How very sad this beautiful young lady, her life was gone. It's very senseless, very, very hard to understand.
Born in 1956, Savannah Anderson grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and had big dreams.
She was 22 when she moved to Irvine. She came here looking for a better opportunity. She was very independent, and she wanted to do it on her own. I met Savannah when she was working here for Commercial Credit. Savannah was a secretary for the operations manager. She just was like a magnet. She was very, very pretty. I remember when people did come in the office, especially the men, she did attract attention.
Savannah was flattered, but she did have a boyfriend, Bill Mills, whom she met 3 months after moving to California.
She was more of a private person into herself as far as not one to just open up and tell everybody what she was doing. She was definitely on the shy side. When I found out what had happened to Savannah, I felt angry and just crushed and so hurt. My first thought was just how tragic this was. I just can't imagine.
It's kind of the horror story. Who could have done this? Could it be somebody close to her, somebody who knows her, somebody who likes her, somebody who has a fantasy over her? When you have a brutal killing like Savannah's case, detectives immediately looked for the people that are close to her, her boyfriend.
The fact that Bill, the boyfriend, was the one that called the police, is he innocently calling the police here because he doesn't know that something had happened to her? Or is he the one who may have done it, so he contacted the police to say, gee, something might be wrong, with the hopes that the police will go ahead and discover the crime, and then say, well, it can't be the boyfriend because he called us here. Could it be almost a way out to try to point the finger away from you? It's just something you have to look into.
Coming up, police question the grieving boyfriend to see if he has something to hide.
His attorney advised him not to take a polygraph.
And detectives uncover more suspects.
Why is he here now at this time? That was suspicious.
Somebody was lying.
Another crime turns the investigation on its head.
This individual was responsible for 5 murders. Perhaps she was the victim of this killer.
And the perpetrator's identity leaves everyone in shock.
It was absolutely devastating when we found out who it was.
Police investigating the gruesome murder of 22-year-old Savannah Anderson have their first suspect, her boyfriend, Bill Mills.
When you have a crime of passion where somebody is murdered, there are definitely times when a boyfriend who just got angry and upset did the crime.
The first thing we did was began meeting with Bill Mills so we could understand better about Savannah, his relationship.
Bill tells police he and Savannah started dating 6 months ago, and he was in love.
They had met each other in another apartment community. They had gotten along well.
He was about 9 years older than Savannah. In talking with him, had learned that he had just asked her to marry him.
Police are curious if something came up to disrupt the couple's plans for the future.
It was a large, violent crime scene. Did he do it because he was angry at her?
Bill tells investigators he last saw Savannah a day earlier on May 13th.
They had brunch together, and then he spent the day over at her apartment. During the interview with Bill Mills, we found out that Savannah and he did have sex that day. So that would be important later on in case there was semen found inside of her.
Bill told me on the 13th he left her apartment at about 10 p.m.
Once he did leave, what happened to him? Can anybody account for his activity after he apparently left her apartment?
He said he went home, he went to bed, and then to work the following day.
Bill says he and Savannah had plans on the 14th after they both got off work.
He went to her apartment about 6, knocked, couldn't raise her. He went back home for a while, then Bill Mills went ahead and contacted the police department.
Bill denies having anything to do with Savannah's death.
It appeared that Bill Mills was really in love with her, thought it was a very serious relationship. He was very happy with her.
Bill was cooperative. He tried to assist us as much as he could.
But there is one request Bill won't comply with.
There is a red flag. He was asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph. He contacted an attorney, and his attorney advised him not to take one.
We did ask if we could see his body, his hands, his arms, see if there's any indications of a struggle with anybody. But his body was clean. We asked him if we could go ahead and take his finger and palm prints.
He agreed to let us do that.
It will be weeks before the results come in. In the meantime, detectives are forced to let Bill go. Next, they move on to another man in Savannah's life.
Part of the investigation and process was to meet with her boss, Ken Bergeson, who had been at the crime scene. In speaking with him, he said he had known her in Salt Lake and had offered her a job locally here.
Ken Bergeson also said that he kind of considered himself a father figure to her. He helped her move. They had talked many times, been out for drinks, been out for lunch and different things.
Could Ken have wanted more than a professional relationship with Savannah?
Was anything going on romantically in the present day?
I asked Ken where he was the night of May 13th, and he indicated that he was with his wife that whole evening.
We did contact the wife to verify that, and there's no reason to believe that he was anywhere but at his home that night.
After the interview, we asked Ken to submit his prints so they could be compared against the crime scene.
We just let him go home that night after the interview.
The police questioned each one of us in the office. I worked for Ken Bergeson at the time. He was just such a nice guy and so concerned about her. She was living by herself, and she was just so beautiful. I just thought, somebody saw her. Somebody was either stalking her or something happened. But I was just so angry that somebody could possibly do something like this. It had to have been somebody I thought who was very sick.
There was nothing really that drew anyone's attention to any issues that Savannah had at work, and nothing came of it.
Police canvassed the apartment complex the next day, searching for witnesses.
We didn't find anyone that said that they'd heard any struggle or screams to corroborate when that attack may have occurred. There were 2 security guards that were assigned to the complex. It was a multi-unit under construction.
So after I got the names of the security personnel who worked that night, which was about a week after we originally responded out there, I talked to the security guard first who worked the midnight to 6:30 shift. His name was Chuck Doyle.
According to Doyle, security was hired to ensure the residents were safe and to overlook any construction sites and that sort of thing for theft.
Chuck tells investigators on a usual shift he would drive through the complex and also patrol by foot.
I asked him how he found out about the murder of the woman, and he said he found out through the company. I asked him if he knew the lady who lived there, showed him 2 pictures, and he picked out the picture of Savannah Anderson.
When asked about his dealings with Savannah, Chuck's answer gives investigators cause for concern.
He indicated about a month prior that he'd helped Savannah gain entry into her apartment and slid a window open for her.
It was notable that Mr. Doyle had said he was aware that at least at that time one of the windows was unlocked.
Doyle said, "You'll find my fingerprints on Savannah's window, and this is the reason why." Immediately, we printed him. It really made me zero in on him as a potential suspect.
A week after Savannah Anderson was found bludgeoned to death in her bed, security guard Chuck Doyle has drawn suspicion after admitting that his fingerprints are likely on her unlocked window.
She had locked herself out of her apartment before, contacted him while he was on the site to see if he could help her get into the apartment. The security did not have any pass keys. He found that a window was unlocked. He was able to slide the window open. He also said that he didn't go inside. Now, that could be for a couple of reasons. Could be perfectly innocent that he didn't go inside. Could also be to say, well, I didn't go inside if he may have somehow be involved in the death.
Had Chuck slipped in through the same unlocked window to kill Savannah? Police press him for his movements that night.
Chuck Doyle said that he reported for duty on the 14th at midnight, or was supposed to, indicated that he was about 10 minutes, 15 minutes late.
He was supposed to replace a security guard named
Bob Sellers.
He drove by Savannah's and saw her talking on the phone. He thought maybe that was around 12:15 or so, 12:20, but was not certain.
He went and parked next to Bob Sellers' car. About 12:30, he estimated, Sellers approached. He got daily reports from Sellers, and then Sellers went ahead and got in his car and drove off.
When detectives ask what happened next, Chuck's answer raises even more suspicion.
He said he drove around a while, went back to the carport, and went to sleep, which would seem very odd.
He thought he probably nodded off for a while.
Doyle says that he was awoken by a car door slam. It was Sellers who had returned and invited him to breakfast. Doyle says it was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. They went to breakfast at Spire's restaurant, a 24-hour cafe.
The cafe is just 10 minutes from the complex.
Doyle said that he was dropped off by Sellers at about 2:30 in the morning.
Chuck says the rest of his shift was uneventful, and he clocked out at 6:30 a.m.
There's just something really unusual about the sequence of events that's being described by Doyle.
Investigators are left with more questions than answers. Did Savannah die on Chuck's watch? Or was he the one who killed her? Hoping for clarity and to corroborate Chuck's story, they turn to the other security guard, Robert Sellers.
Robert Sellers enlisted into the Marine Corps at age 17. He's 22 now.
He was assigned that day to work from about 4 in the afternoon, and he was supposed to get off at about midnight that night. I asked him if he knew who Savannah Anderson was. He said he had talked to both her and her boyfriend that evening.
Sellers told me that he thought he saw Savannah around 10 p.m. on the phone.
Robert confirms that Chuck was late for work, so he didn't leave the apartment complex until around 12:30 a.m.
After leaving Doyle, he then went home, showered.
As a U.S. Marine, he was supposed to go to a Marine base. At 6 o'clock in the morning,
he decided it wasn't worth trying to go to sleep, so he thought, well, I'll just go out to breakfast with Doyle. So that's when he returned.
Sellers told me that he came back to the complex about 3:30, which is an hour and a half or 2 hours after what Doyle recalled this happening. So there was this inconsistency between the both of them about what time they must have gone to the restaurant. Sellers said there was a waitress named Gail who waited on him. I took note of that. At the end of the Sellers interview, we asked if he would go ahead and give us finger palm prints, which he agreed to.
Investigators hope the autopsy report can help them pinpoint Savannah's time of death.
According to the coroner's report, Savannah Anderson died at approximately 2 a.m. on May 14th. The cause of death was strangulation.
She'd been struck on the head many times, found multiple contusions on her face. There was broken fingernails, a broken jaw, cracked teeth.
We did have biological fluids, semen, that was found, but DNA was not in existence at the time, so we didn't have that tool.
My first thought was just how horrible to die like that. I cried and I was just very upset just thinking that something like that had happened to a person that was just so lovely. It's just terrible.
If Savannah was killed at 2 a.m., which security guard is telling the truth? Was Chuck really off-site like he claimed? Or was Robert right, meaning Chuck was at the apartment complex when the murder took place?
There was a wide gap and discrepancy between their two stories and timing. So the two were brought in together to try and determine if someone was mistaken about times.
They both basically stuck to their stories. I wasn't sure which either timeline might have been correct, whether it might have been Doyle's or Sellers, because they were just too far apart. So we thought at that time somebody was lying.
Detectives are investigating the disturbing murder of Savannah Anderson. The 2 security guards from her apartment complex are unable to agree where they were at 2 a.m. when Savannah was killed.
The timing is very sketchy between what Doyle says and what we learn from Sellers.
This is raising a lot of flags to me because why don't they know where they were and what time they were?
Going over time discrepancies, Doyle said, well, I slept. I could be mistaken. I'm not sure. So Sellers seemed to be more credible time-wise.
According to Robert Sellers, Chuck was on duty at 2 a.m., and the pair only went to Spire's restaurant around 3:30 a.m.
I asked one of the patrol guys to go ahead and try to contact any waitress there that might have been named Gail to see if she recalled the security guys coming in there at all. They weren't able to find a Gail that worked at the Spire's restaurant, so we could not identify that particular part of the story. It looked like the best chance of us determining who the suspect was going to be through the fingerprint and palm print evidence left behind. At this time, we already had fingerprints and palm prints from the boyfriend, Bill Mills, the boss, Ken Bergerson, and from the 2 security guards, Chuck Doyle and Bob Sellers. And I felt that if we can find out if any of those were the palm prints, that's going to be the resolution of our case. We'd be able to determine who had done it. So we sent them away with high hopes that we're going to be able to resolve the case once we get the results back.
While waiting for the results, investigators dig deeper into Savannah's life, hoping something will point to her killer.
Savannah seemed to be a very likable person who had, from all reports, a good mind, good IQ, personable, funny, one that you would be very happy to have as a daughter.
She was very sweet, very sophisticated, quiet. She had very strong values and morals. You know, she was just not one of those that was going to be out looking for trouble. Just how she went and how young she went is so tragic. Our world is, it's cruel.
We interviewed neighbors. Savannah had been at the apartment complex about 6 weeks. Her contacts, friends were very limited. What I learned through investigation was Savannah had moved deliberately for the safety of having security on the premises.
She really wanted a place that felt safe, and the fact that they had security, she loved that aspect of it. She felt really good about where she was going.
2 months after Savannah's death, police received the results of the finger and palm print analysis from the scene.
I was really hoping we heard back from the crime lab that it's going to be one of the guys we'd already talked to.
In terms of identification and finding and identifying that individual, it was everything.
None of the prints that came back were any of the fingerprints submitted from the bloody finger and palm prints. Really disappointing. Couldn't figure out why. It seemed like there should have been somebody in there that was responsible for it. Yet the crime lab is telling us that these weren't the responsible parties at all. We thought we had some viable suspect, but we're told, nope, it's not them. Well, now what? Wow.
The results mean Savannah's boyfriend, her boss, and the 2 security guards are all cleared.
I was very discouraged, but thought, okay, we just haven't come across the perpetrator. He's out there. We'll find him. We'll identify him. I feel comfortable with that based on the palm print.
Detectives immediately looked for people in the area that maybe had criminal histories. They looked at people that had been arrested after that for similar type of break-in crimes. And if they had any suspicions whatsoever, they would get their palm print and their fingerprints, and they'd compare them to the crime scene prints and then rule them out if they didn't match.
3 months after the crime, police had collected about 100 different print impressions.
The palm prints didn't match. It was extremely frustrating to work through this.
With the case threatening to turn cold, detectives refused to quit and take the case in a chilling new direction.
After going through potential suspects that were eliminated through the palm print, we began to examine that Savannah Anderson may be the victim of a serial killer known as the Bedroom Basher. This individual was responsible for 5 murders in the Orange County area at the time.
With a population under 2 million people, the number of attacks in a matter of months is troubling, and the similarities striking.
He would target young lone females between 17 and 35, ground floor apartments, open windows, open doors. Once inside, he would bludgeon, strangle, and sexually assault the females. So Savannah certainly fit that MO. And so we had to take a real strong look at perhaps she was the victim of this individual who had not been identified. We could be looking for a serial killer.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of Savannah Anderson now believe she may have fallen victim to a serial killer.
Bedroom Basher went after females in homes or apartments in the Orange County area, raped them, in at least one case, killed somebody by bludgeoning them, which is what happened to Savannah.
Based upon the number of bludgeonings in Orange County, which were 5, we felt that there would be another that would take place.
5 months after Savannah's murder, investigators' worst fears are confirmed when the serial killer strikes again.
During this time, there was a woman in Orange County that had been attacked, believed by the Bedroom Basher, who survived and was able to give a description to the police. A composite drawing was made. She described the perpetrator as a male, olive skin, pockmarked face, long hair, mustache, dark eyes, in his late 20s, early 30s. A task force was created in Orange County. Flyers were disseminated to the public and to patrol units. It resulted in multiple contacts of people who believed they knew who this individual was. Unfortunately, none of those resulted in the apprehension of the individual.
A year after the murder, with no arrests and a killer on the loose, women in the area live in a constant state of terror.
The community was definitely impacted by this terrible murder. The news was full of these kind of things, and it did create fear among people. The fact that I was living so close by, it's a little scary.
Any female who resided by themselves took extra precautions to ensure that their windows, doors were in fact locked. Every possibility we looked at, we were unable to make any headway in determining what happened to Savannah Anderson. It was extremely frustrating. There was no one else that we were aware of that could provide any insight and or potentially could be a suspect.
3 years after Savannah's murder, her case remains unsolved.
After you go through tips, leads, you step back, you re-examine, you say, what did I miss? It's got to be there. What did I miss?
I've started to believe that they just weren't going to find out. And that's terrible to think that something like that could happen and that this person is out there roaming around still.
2 more years pass until a rookie homicide detective takes a renewed interest in the case.
Savannah's case was the first cold case that I ever worked. I was familiar with it because I was in patrol when it happened, and I thought, well, nobody's looked at it for a while. Maybe I should look at it.
A friend of mine who knows Larry Montgomery very well calls him the evidence whisperer.
I was aware he was looking at the Savannah Anderson case, and at one point he came to me and we compared notes on it.
After combing through all the evidence, detectives revisit whether Savannah was a victim of the still unidentified Bedroom Basher.
The possibility that she was killed by a serial killer was definitely looked at. I was looking at anything that I could use to direct me to a possible suspect. I'm looking at what was done at the crime scene, what did the suspect do with the body, what was maybe in his mind because of what he did.
In comparing Savannah's murder to those committed by the bedroom basher, something just doesn't add up.
The one thing that stood out that was not similar was the cleaning up of the victim.
When I look at a crime scene like this, it's somebody who has a desire for Savannah. She appeared uninjured other than towels on top of her face. It wasn't the gore that he liked. He had to kill her in order to get her into a position where he could fantasize about having an actual relationship with her. This is a real girl now as opposed to a dead body. The question in this case is, who did it? All the people we've looked at and that looked good were not matching the prints. There was one point where I started looking at the security guards to see what they were doing because they were certainly involved in being there at the time. There were very big differences between what Doyle said happened and what Sellers said happened that night. And I thought that was very odd.
I thought at the time that I interviewed Doyle that one of the problems was he may have gone to sleep for a while. That would certainly account for the timeline being different or his uneasiness in talking to us about that particular time period.
Police quickly locate Chuck and bring him in for another interview. His story about what happened the night of the murder is the same, but a few details stand out.
Doyle said that he got to the site probably 10 minutes late. He had not been able to find the person he was supposed to replace yet, Bob Sellers. About 12:30, Doyle saw Sellers come with a shirt in his hand, and I asked Doyle, did you ever ask him why he was late or why he didn't have his uniform shirt on? He said, no, he never asked him that. He just figures he's on his own time, so he could probably wear whatever he wants.
That's unusual. That right there's a big red flag.
That's not the only thing that raises alarm bells.
Doyle said that Sellers had commented about wanting to have a drink with Savannah. He thought she was very attractive.
Detectives asked Chuck Doyle if Robert Sellers ever confided anything else to him.
Regarding the relationship between Doyle and Sellers, they weren't buddies. They didn't do things together. They weren't really close friends.
Following this lead, investigators asked Chuck if it was common for them to go for breakfast during a shift, like they did the night of the murder.
They never did that before, so why is Sellers there on a night when he's supposed to leave soon to go to work at the Marine base, saying, hey, you want to go get something to eat? It didn't seem to fit, but I had the paperwork that shows that he had been exonerated. It wasn't his print. But I saw all kinds of things that Sellers did that was suspicious. Why is he here now at this time? It all fits if he came back and did something with the body at that time. It all made sense time-wise. And that's when I decided we need to find those prints again and see if we matched them properly.
Five years after Savannah Anderson was found murdered in her apartment, cold case investigators suspect her killer has been hiding in plain sight the entire time.
I've got a suspicion that this guy, Robert Sellers, might be the guy because there's too many lies or mistakes. He's already been exonerated, and I didn't believe the exoneration. We need to find somebody who's better than our sheriff's department, who's best in the world that we can get.
Robert's prints and the ones found at the crime scene are rushed to FBI headquarters.
The FBI discovered that some parts of the palm print were so thick with blood that it became a negative. It was the opposite of what it should be because of the thick blood. The thick blood looked like the ridges when really they were the valleys of the print.
The FBI reanalyzed the palm print and compared it to prints obtained from Robert.
The next day, the fingerprint lab at the FBI was able to identify in about 24 points of identification a positive identification of security guard Bob Sellers.
We have to arrest him now. Sellers, at the time that he was arrested, was living in a mobile home up in Brea at the police department. He was presented with evidence that his prints are, in fact, in the blood there. He didn't come forward right away, but very quickly, after he had some lies, he did admit that he did everything that we thought he did.
He was obsessed with her. He found her very attractive. He thought perhaps by going into her apartment that he might convince her of some romantic get-together. He gained entry into her apartment through an unlocked window where he could hear her on the telephone talking with her mother. He stayed in the bedroom hid as best possible while she talked in the kitchen living room area. Once she got off the phone at about a little after 12, she came into the bedroom. When she saw him, she was thinking, I have an intruder, a man in here, and I'm frightened. And he became frightened and realized that he had to silence her. He pulled out his baton and began striking her. He then went to strangulation.
During the struggle with Savannah, he said that his shirt got bloody, so he had to take it off. So when he went to see Doyle, he had his shirt in his hand so that his replacement would not see the blood on it.
And then he goes home, gets cleaned up, sneaks back in, and then goes into Savannah's apartment. Sellers wanted her sexually. He had to kill her to get that. He did talk about he wanted her to be clean, and so that's why he drug her into the shower and washed the blood off of her and took her back into the bedroom and wrapped her head in towels because she was so badly beaten. So then he just had a body that was clean and he could have his fantasy. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he's trying to sneak out, and that's when Doyle sees him, and that's when, at the spur of the moment, he has to all of a sudden pretend like, oh, I'm here to go to breakfast with you, okay? He almost seemed relieved when he finally was able to confess that he actually did kill Savannah.
On March 29th, 1984, Robert Sellers is charged with murder, rape, attempted rape, and burglary.
I think after 5 years, he thought he probably did get away with it. In that time, he got married, started a family. The anguish that he caused with Savannah Anderson's death, he didn't deserve having that extra 5 years.
On November 4th, 1986, Robert Sellers is found guilty of first-degree murder and a special circumstance of rape. But his lawyers win his appeal.
His conviction was overturned on a technicality. The fact that the prosecution could not prove that she was alive during the rape changed the verdict for a life without possibility of parole.
Instead of a retrial, prosecutors offer Robert a deal. He accepts to avoid the death penalty and pleads guilty to first-degree murder. He is sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
Here you have a guard, a man, a Marine, placed there to protect the residents, and it turned out he is the one committing the crime. One would not expect the one who is protecting you to be your killer.
It was absolutely devastating when we found out who it was. The irony of it all was the fact that she moved to this beautiful apartment complex thinking she was going to be safe and secure. And it was the security guard that actually did it. It was like, are you kidding? Nobody could believe it.
Authorities don't find anything to link Robert Sellers to the bedroom basher killings. In 1996, Gerald Parker was identified and convicted of those crimes. In 1999, Robert Sellers died in prison.
I do feel there was justice, especially when I found out that he died after he had been in prison. That was justice right there. When I remember Savannah, I think of this beautiful young woman, just the prettiest smile. She was very, very poised. I think she would have definitely had a bright future had her life not been taken in any sense of the manner, whether she had married and had a family or gone on in the business world. She just was a very lovely person.
A vibrant and loving young mother.
She was just an awesome person. She had a little feisty side to her because of the redhead, but she was always looking out for everybody else.
is found savagely murdered inside an office building washroom.
There was insulated electrical wire used to strangle her.
It appeared there had been a sexual assault.
Detectives pursue multiple suspects.
There were problems with the marriage. They had had issues. They had been arguing.
He was in the building the night she was killed. His prints matched the prints inside the bathroom stall.
And hunt down an elusive killer.
We talked to the attorney who states that he is probably somewhere in South America.
I said, okay, where's he at? Can we get him?
That no one could have imagined.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it.
It was very unexpected to see him as the actual killer.
Known for its live music scene, Austin, Texas is also one of the safest big cities in the country.
Austin's kind of one of those cool vibe cities, and it's just a very good mix of people.
There's a lot of green belts and parks and creeks and trails. It's a really neat place to live. Austin has not had the kind of crime and the volume of crime as other large cities. People do typically feel safe.
But in 1983, the town is rocked when a local businessman makes a gruesome discovery.
In the early morning hours of September 20th, 1983, the Austin Police Department received a 911 call. One of the tenants of an office complex had come in the morning and discovered things were out of place. There was a cleaning cart out in the hallway, so he went to try to find out if anyone else was still in the building. He did discover a deceased female in the upstairs men's restroom.
The 911 caller did not know her name, but he recognized her as the woman who did clean the building.
Police are dispatched to the scene.
When we located the female victim in the men's restroom, she was positioned inside of the stall.
She was undressed. There was insulated electrical wire that had small loops tied on the ends of them. Detectives believed that electrical wire was used to strangle her and be the cause of her death. It appeared, because she had no defensive wounds at all, that the killer came up from behind and surprised her.
Everything in the crime scene suggested that this was a violent attack.
There was wet toilet paper inside of her nose and her mouth. It stands to reason the killer put that in her mouth and her nose after he strangled her to ensure that she was good and dead.
There was a bodily fluid and a clothing that made it appear as if she was drug across the floor. Her clothes were scattered amongst the restroom, and it appeared that there had been a sexual assault. The victim was identified by an ID that was found inside of her purse. She was Lori Stout, a 22-year-old female from Austin.
While forensics collect samples, investigators look for other evidence left behind by the killer.
A significant fingerprint was located in the men's stall of the restroom.
When dragging her in there, the person would almost have to brace themselves on the wall of the inside of the stall. The print inside the bathroom stall matched a print on the second floor fire escape. So the two of those were pretty significant.
Had the killer fled through the fire escape after committing the murder? Detectives head down to the parking lot looking for more clues.
They found that there was a spool that was used for insulated electrical wiring inside the dumpster. They also found some looser pieces of the same type of wiring that was used to kill the victim.
Detectives bag the items for analysis. Back inside, police start piecing together a theory of who could have committed this horrible act.
The fact that the victim was killed inside the building in the middle of the night suggested that whoever did this had access or a key to get in it.
Detectives canvassed the building and talked to employees, but determined that no one had seen anything suspicious.
We were able to talk with two witnesses that saw Lori at about 12:30 a.m. as they locked up and secured the building and left.
We know that she was last seen alive around 12:30 in the morning, and the employee at the building discovered her body around 8 a.m. So she died sometime during that time frame.
Just as investigators are finishing up, a frantic man arrives at the scene. He identifies himself as Gary Stout and demands to know where his wife Lori is.
Gary Stout told detectives he woke up that morning and discovered that his wife was not home yet from work. He got worried and he drove up to the building, which was a short distance away, and discovered her car still in the parking lot. But it was surrounded by numerous police cars. It was at that point that the police spoke with him and broke the news that his wife was found dead.
He was obviously traumatized about what had happened.
As police take Gary down to the station for questioning, the devastating news soon spreads to the rest of Lori's family.
I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. My whole world changed. I no longer had my confidant, no longer had my best friend. It was horrible, horrible.
When we found out that Lori had been killed, it was a big impact. It was overwhelming.
Born in Arlington, Virginia in 1960, Lori Coffey was a naturally warm and caring soul.
Lori was the oldest of Laurie, myself, and TJ, but she was kind of the mother hen of us all. She had a little feisty side to her, and I think maybe because of the redhead, but she was always looking out for everybody else. She was just an awesome person. She really, truly was.
Lori was the leader of us three musketeers, me, Beverly, and Lori. And she kept us going.
After moving to Austin with her mother and siblings, in 1977, Lori met Gary Stout, who worked logistics for the military.
It all flourished very fast. She was so giddy about Gary, and they fell in love. All in all, he just seemed like a good guy, so we were all, okay, so this is it.
After a whirlwind courtship, Lori and Gary married the following year. 3 years later, Lori became pregnant.
She was over the moon. Very, very happy. I mean, that's what she wanted. She wanted to be married, start having a family, and she was on her way.
But Lori is soon forced to face the harsh realities of military family life.
Gary got orders to go to Belgium. She was very sad. Lori was sad that Gary was gone overseas, and here she was facing having a baby on her own at home.
On January 26, 1982, while Gary is away, Lori gives birth to a baby girl.
Lori had a really easy labor, and, now we have this little baby, and, of course, she was ecstatic.
I think that she very much enjoyed being a mother. I think that she experienced probably the happiest months of her life after I was born.
In order to spend more time with his family, Gary left the military and took a job as a maintenance worker in the same building where Lori worked nights as a cleaner.
She was very excited that he was coming home. That's all she wanted, just to be a mom and wife, homemaker.
With her life finally on track, how did this loving young mother become the victim of a cold-blooded killer?
As with any investigation, you have to look at those that are closest to the victim and those that have motive. As an employee of the building, a maintenance worker there, Gary had access.
Down at the station, police questioned Gary about his marriage to Lori.
When we asked him about any problems in the relationship, he quickly admitted that they had had issues, they had been arguing, and were unhappy.
Detectives discovered that Lori actually went and stayed with her sister, Beverly, shortly before the murder happened because of a really big argument that she had with Gary.
Things were not going all that well for her and Gary, and she was miserable.
This definitely created a concern that there were problems with the marriage. So knowing that he has access and motive, it raises the level of suspicion that he could have been involved in this crime.
Coming up, detectives uncover disturbing secrets.
He wasn't happy in his relationship, and he admitted that he was looking at leaving her.
Lori's family felt very strongly that he was the killer.
before a shocking tip takes police in a whole new direction.
We received information from a female victim of a man that committed a similar attack against her.
This is a big turning point in the investigation.
Could this be a serial rapist? Could it be a serial murder?
It has detectives risking it all to catch a killer.
He knew it was going to have to be something big for us to find him.
We were holding our breath. We weren't sure it was going to happen.
Police investigating the murder of 22-year-old mother Lori Stout are questioning their first suspect, her husband Gary.
When Gary was being interviewed, he was very forthcoming about the poor state of his marriage with Lori. So it was a little bit of a red flag.
At this point in the investigation, we need additional information about problems that may be in their relationship.
Lori and Gary were happy. When they first got married, she was proud to be a wife. That's all she wanted.
But things changed when Gary returned from overseas.
Lori wanted it to just be like it was before he left, and unfortunately that was not the case.
So knowing the family's account of their relationship as well, knowing that it was a volatile relationship, that created concern that he could have been frustrated with Lori and committed this type of act.
When detectives pressed Gary for details about why his marriage was falling apart, he makes an alarming confession.
He admitted that he had actually had an affair and was looking at leaving Lori.
Gary tells detectives that he met a woman while overseas and that she had since come to visit him in Austin.
At this point, the detectives are wondering, does Gary want Lori out of the picture given the very bad state of their marriage and the fact that he wants to be with this woman he's having an affair with?
Gary explains that he ultimately chose to stay with Lori, but detectives become even more suspicious after they ask him for an alibi.
He stated that the night before, he and Lori had an argument, so she went and slept on the couch. At one point, she finally just got up in the early morning hours, went to work. Gary did not have an alibi that we could confirm. He was at home with a young child, asleep. He could have left his house, gone up to the building, and come back. That would not be something we could verify.
So the marital difficulties, and now we've got a big fight, and Gary having access to the building. He's somebody that they're looking at pretty hard.
Detectives asked Gary to provide samples of his blood and fingerprints to be compared with evidence found at the crime scene.
He was cooperative with us. He provided samples that were requested.
Looking further into Gary's movements leading up to the murder, investigators reach out to his boss at the office building.
The manager of the building informed the detectives that Gary had fixed a water heater the day before Lori was killed. And he used the same type of electrical wiring that was used to kill Lori.
This was another extremely big flag in the case. All these things together really raised the suspicion that this is the guy.
As police wait for forensic testing results, Lori's autopsy report comes in.
Lori's cause of death was in fact strangulation, and that seemed to match the ligature found at the scene.
What was determined is that a sexual assault had taken place.
They were able to get a sample of semen. However, this is 1983, so there was no DNA testing available. In order to do any comparison, we used blood type antigens. This kind of evidence is helpful in narrowing down the field of suspects.
When we found out how Lori was actually killed, it was disturbing. First thought to my mind, one sick individual. One very sick individual. They did it.
Pure evil. Absolute pure evil.
Detectives eagerly receive the results of Gary's fingerprints and blood tests, but they are far from conclusive.
Gary's fingerprints did not match the one inside the stall, but did match prints in the building. But he has access to the building and he is working there. His blood type, it matches the type found in the semen. But of course, Gary is married to Lori, so it's another piece of evidence that can go both ways.
Ultimately, we couldn't use fingerprints or any blood work to exclude him.
Running out of options, detectives try one last method to get to the truth.
Gary Stout was provided an opportunity to take a polygraph. During that interview, he was asked if he was responsible for the murder of Lori, and he advised he wasn't. The results of that polygraph indicated that he was being truthful and there was no deception.
Detectives were surprised that Gary passed the polygraph. Now, detectives have motive, they have access, but no evidence conclusively to show that Gary is in fact the killer.
With nothing to hold him on, Gary is free to go.
At this point, Gary is not ruled out as a suspect, but he takes a little bit more of a backseat.
Looking for new leads, investigators turn their focus back to the numerous employees who work at the building where Lori was killed.
What's difficult, particularly about a public space like this, is so many people have access. We talked to everybody that was a tenant in that building and started working our way through that process. Many of those folks were excluded based on fingerprints, evidence, everything else that could really put them to the side.
But police learned that the building's tenants weren't the only ones who had access that night.
We discovered that registration was being conducted from the University of Texas' satellite location at this office complex. And they stayed late after hours so that folks could come after work and sign up late into the evening. So this was definitely something of interest for us.
Detectives were able to get the names of the male students who had gone in that night, and they had them come down to the police department and they got fingerprints of these individuals.
Police processed the fingerprints of over a dozen students and receive an alarming result.
We were able to rule everyone out on the list with the exception of one. We had a match, a fingerprint inside the men's restroom as well as a fire escape door. So this person is somebody we want to talk to and interview.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of Lori Stout have just matched a set of crime scene fingerprints with someone who was in the building that night.
The University of Texas was having a sign-up registration at the satellite campus, which allowed people to come after hours in the evenings after work in order to get signed up for classes. So we start going through the list of registrants.
Detectives were able to determine that there was one student whose prints matched the prints inside the bathroom stall where Lori was found, and also on the fire escape door on that second floor.
That individual was identified as Robert Van Weese, and he was 18 years old.
Investigators interview Robert about his movements on the night Lori was killed.
He told us that he had been there for registration, and on his way out, he used the men's restroom upstairs. Once he was done in the restroom, he exited the fire escape because it was closer to where his vehicle was parked, and which would explain why his fingerprints were found in the men's stall and the fire escape door.
Robert Van Weese did acknowledge that he saw the cleaning lady, which was our victim, Lori, after using the bathroom on the second floor before he exited the building.
Robert tells detectives that he left the building at around 12:15 a.m. Before investigators look to verify his story, they ask Robert for a blood sample to compare to the semen found at the crime scene.
Robert Van Weese was cooperative. He gave the blood sample at the time, and the detectives submitted it for testing.
There is nothing that we discover on Robert Van Weese's criminal history or anything else that causes concern. It appears he's had no contact with law enforcement and no violent offenses in the past.
He came from a family that is very well respected. His parents are pretty well-known surgeons in the Austin area. There didn't seem to be anything that would suggest him to behave in this kind of violent way.
While they wait for the results, detectives look for anyone who can corroborate Robert's story.
Detectives interviewed 2 employees of the education office, and they confirmed that they saw Robert Van Weese leave the building at 12:15. We know Lori was still alive because there were witnesses that confirmed she was alive at 12:30.
With Robert looking less and less like a viable suspect, his blood test results come in.
The analysis of the blood sample told us that Robert was not a match to the bodily fluids found at the crime scene.
The discovery means there is no hard evidence against Robert, and they are forced to let him go.
Robert Van Weese was ruled out and eliminated as a suspect.
With no new leads, the investigation falters. As weeks pass with no arrests, fear in the community grows.
The nature of the crime had created a lot of panic for residents, particularly females. It was difficult because there was no resolution.
It left a lot of fear in the community. The police felt pressure to find out who was responsible for Lori's death. I mean, this was a totally innocent mother, 22 years old, taken from her family in a very violent attack.
The people in and around that area where she was killed, they were interested in knowing what was going on. It was tough on our family. It is very frustrating. There's somebody out there that has taken a life, and you want that person to be held accountable.
Anytime there's a crime committed like this, there's an inherent pressure to solve it, to try to bring some closure and some comfort to the family and to the community.
A person that could do something like this, that's not somebody that's going to stop at that one act. Typically speaking, that person is going to continue to hurt other people.
We're always worried that, he can continue to commit these kind of acts until he's brought to justice.
1 month after Lori's murder, police receive a promising new lead.
We received information from a female victim of a man that committed a similar attack against her. The victim was sexually assaulted and strangled, but she was able to get away.
He mistakenly thought she was dead, and she was able to identify him. That person's name was Daryl Kemp. Daryl Kemp at that point was in prison, but he was not in prison at the time that Lori was killed.
And so we started looking into this. We evaluated the information and started to determine if this could potentially be a suspect in this case.
Police dig into Daryl Kemp's background and discover a disturbing pattern.
It's determined that Daryl Kemp committed an attack in 1960, similar, where the victim was sexually assaulted and strangled.
He was convicted for the rape and murder of a woman named Marjorie Hipperson in California. He did receive the death penalty for that. But later on, that death penalty got overturned.
Ultimately, he was released and paroled in 1978. That's when Daryl Kemp moved to Austin.
His MO matched. He's killed in this fashion before, and he was in Austin at the time. So this is going to be somebody that detectives look at pretty intently.
Could this be a serial rapist? Could it be a serial murder? We had questions that we needed to get answers to.
One month after young mother Lori Stout was found raped and murdered in a bathroom stall, police are investigating a tip that she was the victim of convicted serial killer Daryl Kemp.
Detectives at this time were thinking that Daryl Kemp was a strong possibility as a suspect because of the similar MO, which was sexual assault and strangulation.
Investigators learned that although Daryl is currently in jail for an unrelated crime, he was a free man at the time Lori was killed. Detectives head to prison to question him.
The difficult part about interviewing somebody like Daryl Kemp is he's obviously been down this road before. He's got knowledge of how investigations work, and so information may be withheld or may not be genuine in his responses based on where he thinks or feels like your questions are leading him.
Detectives start by questioning Daryl about where he was around the time of Lori's murder.
They're asking him questions that would help tie him or connect him to the area that the building was located in. They asked if he knew where this building was, where he lived, basically to try to put him in a geographical area, figure out where he frequented.
Daryl tells investigators he wasn't near the office building where Lori was killed and has no ties to the area.
Daryl Kemp was asked if he was familiar with Lori Stout. He said he wasn't. Things that we're trying to pay attention to is whether his statements are truthful. Does his body language support his statement? Does it appear he's being deceptive? And is he forthcoming with his answers?
Not trusting the word of a convicted killer, detectives shift gears.
We was asked if he would take a polygraph. He hesitated with that because he didn't trust polygraphs. He is not cooperative at all.
It's the same story when investigators ask him for his fingerprints and a blood sample.
Again, he was very uncooperative.
Based on all the evidence collected, we had enough information to obtain a warrant.
Police collect Daryl's samples and eagerly wait for the results.
When the results of the analysis were returned, it was determined that he was not the suspect in this murder. It's very difficult and frustrating because we're at a stalling point again.
With no other leads, the case once again hits a wall. As the months turn into years, Lori's loved ones struggle with the lack of closure.
Why are we not getting any answers? Give us something. I myself have been lost without her.
Every time October 1st rolls around, first thing I think is, it's Lori's birthday. Anytime when September comes around, when she was taken from us, it's not good.
The suspicion that Lori's husband Gary was the killer continues to linger and causes a deep divide.
My mother's family, even members of his own family, believed that my dad was involved.
We all still had that suspicion that Gary had something to do with it.
Eventually, Gary takes Dale and moves out of state.
Gary, he didn't want to have anything else to do with us. So it was like, oh my God, now we can't see Dale. I lost my sister, but I also lost that connection with my niece.
Being so young, she didn't really remember her mom. So it was probably quite hard on Dale.
When I was growing up, there weren't a whole lot of conversations about my mother. It was just the understanding of she wasn't there anymore.
As Dale grows older, she begins to ask questions.
My dad did not like talking about it. I did not have a family member sit me down and explain to me that this is what had happened to her. It wasn't until I got older, got access to the internet, that's when I learned that she was attacked, that she had been strangled, that she had been raped, and then she had been murdered. It was very overwhelming finding out about it in that way.
Lori's family continues to push for her killer to be brought to justice.
We never gave up hope. We tried to keep it fresh and focused on it. We were constantly checking in.
We had to get this case closed to help give our family a little peace. It was overwhelming.
The pressure finally pays off. And in 1992, nearly 10 years after Lori's murder, a new team of detectives reopen her case.
Now we have new eyes looking at everything. They look at the crime scene photos. They read all the police reports. They look at the various people that were interviewed.
Part of that process is to go back and look at old evidence. Are there things now that are available to law enforcement that weren't previously available? Is there testing that can be done?
Now we're in 1992, so we have DNA testing, which is much more powerful.
With that in mind, investigators revisit their prime suspect, Lori's husband, Gary Stout.
So Gary was contacted again and provided a DNA sample, which was compared to that obtained at the crime scene.
Police are hopeful that they'll finally have the evidence they need to make an arrest. But when the results come back, they are shocked at what they reveal.
It was determined that Gary was not a match. So officially, he could be ruled out as a suspect and remove the cloud of doubt that had been hanging over his head for some period of time.
I do believe that my father felt relief, but it was very difficult for him to talk about.
With Gary cleared, cold case detectives go back over the old files, line by line.
With any review of a case, you look at who's been interviewed, who's been eliminated, and what was discovered is that one of the reports that was provided as far as the blood typing seemed to have an error.
The documentation that was used to finalize the forensic report that excluded a suspect actually showed that there was a clerical error in that lab report. And that particular suspect should have been included as a suspect, not excluded. This is a big turning point in the investigation.
10 years after wife and mother Lori Stout was savagely murdered, cold case detectives have unearthed a stunning error in the results of a blood test that means a previously cleared suspect might not be innocent after all.
What was discovered is that the report said the subject could be eliminated, but there was a clerical error in the document and it should have read that he could not be eliminated.
This suspect is Robert Van Wiese, the 18-year-old University of Texas student. He was in the building the night Lori was killed, registering for a class, and he's the same person whose prints were found inside the bathroom stall and also on the second floor fire escape door.
Detectives look into what Robert Van Wiese had been doing the last 10 years.
Robert Van Wiese had no criminal history. Here we have this 18-year-old college student coming from a well-to-do family. Parents who are professionals seem to have a very normal, happy upbringing. He was cooperative. So that all combined with the report that we received, naturally excluded him as a suspect.
Could 18-year-old Robert really have committed such a brutal crime?
In talking with witnesses, Robert Van Wiese is seen about 12:15 a.m. and leaving at about 12:30. They see Lori in the building by herself.
Detectives re-examine the fingerprints he left at the crime scene and notice something troubling.
What they discover is that his story of exiting the building through that second floor fire escape door would naturally support fingerprints being left on the inside of that door, as if you're pushing it open to leave. But some prints of his are found on the door handle on the exterior of the door, as if you're opening it to enter the building.
What this told us is that he had obviously left the building, but he had also come back in.
He would have been able to re-enter it through that same door if he had propped it open with something.
The discoveries mean investigators need to talk to Robert, but there's a problem.
We try to locate Robert Van Wiese, but we're not able to. We reach out to family members who are not cooperative. They provide an attorney's contact. We talk to the attorney who states that Robert Van Wiese is probably somewhere in South America.
All evidence up to that point showed he was in the Austin area, and then he likely finds out that he, once again, is a suspect, and now we have DNA testing capability, so he flees.
Fearing Robert has left the country, detectives scramble to find him. They interview dozens of his friends and family members, but no one is willing to cooperate. Before they can launch an all-out search, detectives still need more proof that Robert's the killer. So they come up with a plan to obtain his DNA.
With Robert Van Wiese having fled, we cannot get a sample from him, but what we are able to do is get what's called YSTR testing accomplished. And that's familial DNA, and it's specific to the Y chromosome that all brothers and fathers would share. So since Robert Van Wiese has brothers in the Austin area, that's something we can actually test.
In order to obtain the sample, detectives conducted surveillance with family members, and at one point they observed one of the brothers discard trash and retrieve it.
Trash is not something you need to get a search warrant for because it's what's deemed abandoned. So detectives take specific items that would gather DNA evidence, like razor blades and toothpicks, and they conduct YSTR testing.
When the DNA tests come back, the results are conclusive.
And lo and behold, it's a match.
Finally, we're able to make a direct connection with Robert Van Wiese to the DNA found at the crime scene. It was surprising to know that a young male coming from the background that he did had the ability to do this at such a young age.
There were no red flags with him. And so it was very unexpected to see him as the actual killer.
We finally had a name. I just totally broke down. And so you're trying to wrap your head around how could an 18-year-old do something like this?
It was shocking because I was 18 myself at the time. I would have never have had that cross my mind. I said, okay, where is he at? Can we get him? And then that's when we learned that he was gone.
Robert Van Wiese is charged with murder and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, and a warrant is issued for his arrest. Investigators team up with the FBI and launch an international manhunt.
The Van Wiese family owned a lot of properties throughout Mexico. We conducted telephone toll analysis. We looked at financial records. We monitored travel of Van Wiese's family. We did a tremendous amount of ground surveillance on locations where we thought he might be. There were some tips that the FBI received for sightings of Van Wiese in Mexico in certain locations, but we weren't successful in locating him.
Years pass with no sign of Robert, but detectives refuse to quit.
All you want to do is bring the guy back so he can face justice and get some kind of closure for the victims. But even the FBI, we have limited access, limited resources, and Mexico is a big country. There's plenty of places for him to hide.
It is very frustrating because for me, I've lived my entire life waiting for justice, but also very cognizant of the fact that it may never happen.
Then in 2016, the hunt for Robert Van Wiese takes a promising turn.
Van Wiese had been on the run for 20 years, so I knew it was going to have to be something big for us to find him. And so we discussed it, and we said, let's do it. Let's go for it.
On December 13th, 2016, the FBI places Robert Van Wiese on their top 10 most wanted list.
This was huge for our case because it brings awareness, but also that comes with a $100,000 reward. So it was exciting to know that we're making traction.
Once we announced his addition to the FBI's 10 most wanted list, we again interviewed people that knew him and possibly knew where he was. Probably the most important interview was with Van Wiese's mother. We said, Robert is going to be arrested. He is coming home. The safest way is to turn himself in. I think the mother realized with the $100,000 reward, his name on the 10 most wanted list, that it was going to be insurmountable that he was going to get arrested.
The pressure pays off, and a phone call comes in that changes everything.
Robert Van Wiese's attorney contacted the district attorney's office to let them know that he wants to turn himself in.
33 years after the murder of Lori Stout, her elusive killer, Robert Van Wiese, is ready to return to the U.S. to face justice.
Robert Van Wiese's lawyer contacted the district attorney's office and started to inquire about possible surrender with a plea bargain agreement. Typically speaking, when someone is a fugitive, we do not negotiate. The circumstances in this situation are quite unique. Mexico will not agree to extradite to Texas if the death penalty is on the table. So we will not get him in our hands if he's arrested in Mexico unless we agree to not have death penalty on the table.
Wanting a swift resolution, the district attorney negotiates a deal.
Van Wiese would agree to turn himself in, and they agreed to 30 years in prison.
On January 26, 2017, police head to the Mexican border to meet Robert.
The plan was for him to surrender, but we were holding our breath. We weren't sure it was going to happen.
We're anxious that this is finally going to take place, but until we have Robert Van Wiese in physical custody, we can't let our guard down.
The arrangement was that he would meet us at the halfway point on the pedestrian bridge. There's a line in the middle. On one side says Mexico, on the other side says United States. He was to meet us there at 1 o'clock. He didn't show up.
As the minutes tick by, investigators start to worry they've been duped.
We had assurances from the attorney that he would show up, but at any point during that time, he could have turned around and changed his mind, and there was nothing we could have done.
At 1:36 p.m., a lone figure approaches the border.
He walked up very slowly, stopped at the line. He introduced himself as Robert Van Wiese, and I said to him, "You ready to turn yourself in?" He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes. He said, "Yes." I said, "Step on across." And he took one step over and he was arrested.
Seeing him walk across that bridge and seeing law enforcement put handcuffs on him, it was extremely satisfying.
There had been so much work from so many different people over the years. From 1983, up until 2017, now we have somebody that's accountable and be brought to justice, was one of the most rewarding experiences in my career.
I sent the picture to Dale and let her know we got him. And I get a text back that it apparently was Dale's birthday. So it was pretty emotional.
She showed me a photo of Van Weese being escorted into custody. It's kind of hard to believe that after all of these years that it would be that day of all days that he would turn himself in.
It was, and it still is surreal that it finally did happen. I mean, it just emotions everywhere. I just can't, it's finally over. It's finally over. Finally over.
The plea deal means Robert does not have to speak to investigators, leaving them to piece together how they believe the murder unfolded.
He showed up that night to register for classes. He sees Lori as she's cleaning. It's possible that Robert Van Weese and Lori Stout had an interaction as he passed her. Maybe she spoke to him. He goes to the bathroom, develops his plan on coming back in.
He's opportunistic, and the opportunity rose, and he left through that fire escape door on the second floor, propped it open.
And once the other workers had all left, I think he came back in.
When he came back in, he would have passed in the parking lot the dumpster that had some leftover electrical wiring that Gary Stout had used that day for the hot water heater, and grabbed it and went upstairs and then attacked her, raped her, and killed her. Lori was killed in probably one of the most personal, violent ways that someone can be killed. Robert Van Weese is an extremely cold and calculating person.
On March 28, 2017, Robert pleads guilty to Lori's murder and is sentenced to 30 years in prison. Lori's sister, Beverly, is there to deliver an emotional impact statement.
I looked him right in the eye and told him what he had taken from our family and what it had done. And, I just told him I hope he rots in hell and gets to feel some of that terror that my sister felt that night. I know in my heart he is where he needs to be.
I think Lori's family felt a sense of relief, a sense of closure that maybe now, at least my hope for them now with that is that they could at least start to heal.
Him being arrested and incarcerated does bring closure. I think that that's what everybody dreams about when a crime like this happens to one of their family members.
Still see Lori's face quite often. She was a hoot. Lori was a hoot. I miss her dearly.
I do believe that my life would have been very different if she would have lived. And I know that she would have done anything to make sure that I had what I needed.
I still think of Lori every day. Every single day. There were a lot of good times, good memories with Lori. And I just wish we would have had more.
A loving father of two.
Era muy buen padre, la verdad.
He was extremely hardworking, very likable, very personable.
Is ruthlessly killed outside his home.
There was numerous gunshot wounds to his upper torso.
Whoever shot the victim was extremely angry and was sending a message.
Detectives hunt a cold-blooded murderer.
We identified the weapon as an AK-47.
We received a text message that said, "Nobody messes with me."
People were fearing for their lives because the killer was still out there.
The question starts to creep in of, is this one that may never be solved?
Then, one phone call changes everything.
He said that he was in fear for his life, for what he was going to tell us.
We thought, wow, this is the first break that we've had.
Exposing a killer no one saw coming.
It hit you in the gut. It was somebody that you just never really would have expected.
Le quitó un padre y a mí la mitad de mi corazón.
Mammoth Lakes, California. a pristine ski town in the Sierra Nevada mountains.
People come out here to vacation. They come out here to go skiing, snowboarding, and in the summer months, it's hiking, bicycling, fishing.
It's beautiful. The weather's always sunny. There's always an outdoor aspect that is just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen.
One early fall morning in 2016 turns into a nightmare for the town of Mammoth.
Mammoth Lakes Police Department received a 911 call at approximately 1:50 in the morning, reporting just hearing a series of rapid gunfire and that a neighbor across the street had been shot.
Police and first responders raced to the scene.
Patrol officers found the victim lying in the driveway, and he was lying face down in his own blood.
You had an individual who'd been shot multiple times and the victim's wife standing there. And she's hysterical.
Y yo quise abrazar a Omar, me acuerdo. Y alguien dijo, no lo toques, no lo toques. Yo le dije, pero ¿y por qué no? Si es mi esposo. Quiero saber que él esté bien.
Paramedics arrive and try to resuscitate the victim.
La ambulancia llegó rápido, pero como Omar recibió muchos disparos en el cuerpo, Omar ya había muerto cuando ellos llegaron.
Police learn the victim is 35-year-old Omar Hernandez, and a homicide investigation is launched.
When I arrived on scene, I've never seen anything like that. Omar had approximately 15 gunshot wounds to his body.
There were bullet impact marks all over. In total, there was 30 shell casings that were found.
The victim was laying alongside his vehicle. There was numerous gunshot wounds to his upper torso. His vehicle was still running, coffee cup still laying there, all indications that he was getting ready to go somewhere.
What was also noticed was there were divots that were in the asphalt and in the driveway.
We definitely got the feeling that as the victim laid there, he was continuously being shot.
I felt like it was extremely personal. Whoever shot the victim was extremely angry and was sending a message.
The shell casings provide another surprising but valuable clue.
The caliber of the bullet that was used, that only comes from a high-powered assault rifle.
It was a 7.6 millimeter round, so we believed it had to be an AK-47. To have a weapon of that sort here in Mammoth, I thought was extremely unusual because those are assault weapons. Those are not hunting rifles.
We thought it was potentially gang-related, possibly some sort of hit that somebody definitely wanted to get the job done.
Could this have been a planned execution? Detectives try to speak with Omar's wife, Gladys.
Gladys was hysterical, extremely upset, unable to talk, and she was screaming.
Pero estaba devastada por mi dolor, devastada por el dolor de saber que Omar había muerto. Y estaba, pues, perdida porque decía, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué le hicieron esto a Omar?
Born in 1980, Omar was raised by a single mother in Guadalajara, Mexico, but knew his destiny lay elsewhere.
El sueño de Omar era exacto, venir a Estados Unidos, porque sabía que aquí había más oportunidades. Su visión era crecer, salir adelante y sacar adelante a su mamá.
When Omar was 18 years old, he headed to Mammoth on the advice of a friend, and for 8 years had been successfully working his way up at the same company.
Omar had a good job here in Mammoth. He was a supervisor at Devon's grocery store, which is the main grocery store in Mammoth Lakes.
He was extremely hardworking, very likable, very personable.
At work, Omar was known to be a kind and caring, almost big brother figure to a lot of the employees that he supervised. He took them under his wing and really tried to help them feel like they belonged.
In 2006, Omar met Gladys Gastelum, and romance quickly blossomed.
Lo conocí y amor a primera vista. Sentí que era una gran persona, un hombre increíble.
Omar and Gladys started a family, welcoming the arrival of 2 sons.
Omar, como padre, era fantástico. Era muy, muy buen padre, la verdad.
The young family had a bright future, starting with an event planned for just days after Omar's murder.
Venía toda mi familia de México. Íbamos a bautizar a Mateo. Yo estaba emocionada por el bautizo de mi hijo y porque venía toda mi familia.
Instead of a celebration, Omar's loved ones must now organize a funeral. Looking for answers, detectives questioned Gladys about the hours leading up to the shooting.
She had gone to visit a family member, and Omar stayed home, and she came home right around 10 or 10:30 p.m. that night, and Omar was sleeping.
He was trying to get a good night's sleep before the night shift.
According to Gladys, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, Omar had gotten up, made himself some coffee, and went outside to start the car, to warm it up.
Omar siempre entraba a despedirse y me dio un beso y me dijo, te amo.
And then, shortly after he exited the back door to go to work, she heard the loud gunfire that made her jump up.
Se escucha una ráfaga de muchos disparos y yo me paro asustada. Yo nada más pedí a Dios que no fueran para Omar, que cuidara a Omar porque iba saliendo de mi casa.
So she got dressed really quick, ran outside, and that's when she saw Omar lying face down in the driveway.
Y empiezo a gritar ayuda, por ayuda, ayuda, ayuda. Y le dije al vecino, llama al 911, porque Omar no está bien, algo le hicieron a Omar, le dije, le dispararon a Omar.
When police ask if anyone held a grudge against Omar, Gladys's response is immediate.
The name of Saul Morales came up. Saul Morales had a problem with Omar because Saul had always accused Omar of having an extramarital affair with his wife, Rosalinda, who was also an employee at the Vaughn supermarket.
About a year or so before the murder occurred, investigators learned that Saul had actually gone to Omar and Gladys's home trying to confront Omar over whether these affair rumors were true.
There were disputes between Omar and Saul.
Gladys tells investigators that Saul's behavior had been disturbing.
Saul had confronted her, told her that my wife is having an affair with your husband.
She noticed that he had been driving by the house on a regular basis.
Gladys says she had seen Saul drive by her house as recently as just 3 days before Omar was killed. Things became so bad, Gladys tells police that Omar filed a restraining order against Saul.
That was an attempt for Omar to get Saul to stop coming to his house, stop contacting his wife.
Could Saul's jealous rage have driven him to murder?
Gladys indicated that she was afraid of Saul, and she thought maybe he was so upset over this alleged affair that he possibly could have killed Omar.
And so Saul became a person of interest pretty quickly. At that moment, we felt like, okay, maybe this is the guy.
Coming up, investigators uncover a menacing grudge.
He hated Omar.
He was there to teach Omar a lesson.
Not his motive to murder somebody.
And shocking clues.
The sedan pulled over near where the crime scene occurred.
It was the same vehicle that we'd seen in the video surveillance.
The shell casings recovered were fired from the same gun.
Before a surprise confession reveals a cold-blooded killer.
He described how he just continued to shoot.
Nunca imaginé que él hubiera hecho algo tan desgarrador, algo tan triste.
That was alarming. I knew right then it was huge.
Hours after 35-year-old father of two, Omar Hernandez, was gunned down in his own driveway, his wife Gladys has pointed police towards a possible killer.
Saul Morales was the first suspect in this case because his wife, Rosalinda, had reportedly been having an affair with Omar.
We found out that Saul confronted Omar about the affair.
Saul told Omar to leave his wife alone.
Omar was upset that Saul had come over to his house while his kids were home.
There was a fight that broke out between them and police were called.
Officers arrived on scene and they were separated. No charges were filed, but there still was a documented incident. Gladys did not believe that Omar really did have an affair with Rosalinda. But the important thing was if Saul believed it to be true, then that is motive to murder somebody.
Needing more information about the alleged affair, investigators head to Omar's workplace.
The coworkers described Omar as a nice guy that got along with everybody.
The manager described Omar as a very hardworking person dedicated to the job, was that employee that worked over and beyond what was required of him.
The manager did tell me that he had heard the rumors about Rosalinda and Omar's extramarital relationship, and also he did bring up the fact that at times he would see Saul in Vaughn's walking through the aisles as though he wanted to catch Omar and Rosalinda together.
Learning Saul's wife, Rosalinda, happens to be working her shift at the store, detectives pull her aside for an interview.
She was very, very emotional.
Rosalinda found out about the murder when she came in to work and became very upset.
Investigators confront Rosalinda about the rumors.
Rosalinda denied that there was ever an affair or that there was any sexual relations between her and Omar.
She said that her and Omar's relationship was purely platonic and that her and him had been best friends, and that's the extent of their relationship.
Rosalinda definitely gave me the sense that she was nervous.
In talking to Rosalinda, she appeared to be holding back.
At this point, investigators weren't sure whether the affair was a rumor or whether it was true.
It seemed like the jealousy involved in the case could have been enough for murder. When you see a murder that gruesome, with that many bullets and that much violence, it comes out of some strong emotion.
Police know that even if Saul had motive for murder, he also needed the opportunity.
We asked Rosalinda where Saul was the previous night, and Rosalinda said that Saul was in bed with her the whole night, and then she ended up getting up for work around 3 that morning, and he was still in bed.
I wouldn't say that that particular alibi was rock solid, so interviewing him was very important, just to find out if their stories matched.
Investigators bring Saul down to the station.
When I interviewed Saul, he was extremely calm, extremely courteous, and extremely cooperative.
He was very forthcoming about the altercations that had occurred with Omar in the past, and that he was afraid that Omar had had an affair with his wife.
Investigators ask Saul to account for his movements in the hours leading up to the murder.
Saul claimed that he had gone to visit his uncle, and he was with his uncle throughout the night before coming home, and went to bed right around 11 o'clock that evening.
He said that he was asleep in his bed on the night of the murder and had nothing to do with it. He voluntarily provided a DNA reference sample to exclude him.
Getting DNA from Saul was extremely important because he was a prime suspect in the shooting, and because with fingerprints coming off the bullet casings, you could match the DNA.
Saul also allows detectives to search his home.
I searched the house for weapons, ammunition, or any evidence that could tie him to the crime. But I never found anything that would lead me to believe he had weapons or ammunition in the house.
When the results come in, Saul's DNA does not match the DNA found on the spent shell casings.
His story seemed to be making sense. It seemed to be consistent. There was no indicators that he was lying to us.
And so we didn't have anything to really move on.
I didn't find him to be suspicious. He just wasn't connecting the dots for me. And from my training and experience, he did not give me any indication that he was involved in the shooting. And so that was really frustrating.
With detectives forced to put Saul on the back burner, they revisit the theory that Omar's murder could have been a professional hit.
The weapon used the AK-47. It's a weapon of murder, a weapon of violence, and so the nature of that weapon alone made people think this has something to do with a gang.
Because of the brutal nature of the crime, something we were looking at, is this the cartel? Is this a paid hit? It's gotta be big because of the way it was done.
Police investigating the ruthless shooting of Omar Hernandez outside his home in Mammoth Lakes, California, now suspect he might have been targeted by a criminal gang.
There was speculation that maybe this was a drug deal that went bad and the cartel had come up and put a hit on Omar. Investigators went looking through Omar's background to see if there was any drug affiliations or anything that could have been tied to organized crime.
I didn't find anything in Omar's background that would indicate he had any gang association whatsoever.
No pertenecía a pandillas, él era una persona tranquila, no usaba drogas, no usaba nada.
Investigators move on from the gangland hit theory. Several days later, they discover their security camera footage from a building near Omar's home and hope the video will provide new leads.
The closest camera that had any video surveillance was several hundred yards down the street, so you were capturing vehicles coming and going.
Unfortunately, there were no cameras that were able to actually capture the crime as it occurred.
What the security footage documented was a vehicle circling the area several times prior to the shooting.
We had what we believed was a light-colored four-door sedan. We felt pretty confident that it was a Toyota Camry, a Toyota Corolla. We felt like that vehicle possibly was involved.
Police spot another suspicious vehicle in the footage.
There was a red sedan-type vehicle that was seen at the intersection driving down towards the victim residence.
What was notable was it appeared less than 2 minutes prior to when the murder took place, and then the sedan pulled over near where the crime scene occurred.
Unfortunately, with the low image quality, we weren't able to identify who was in the suspect vehicles.
Undeterred, police show the footage to Omar's wife, hoping she can identify the vehicles. The red sedan provokes a strong reaction.
Gladys said that the day after the shooting, a red sedan drove by with two people inside of it that she recognized as Vaughn's employees. She did say that they gave her a slow roll type of look, as though letting her know they were watching her, or maybe even they were involved.
Sentí miedo en ese momento porque cuando ellos pasan manejando y luego le hacen así, yo sentí mucho temor, sentí miedo.
Gladys told investigators that the two individuals in the car were Jose Antonio Carreras Vasquez and Eliud Carreras Vasquez. They were cousins. Gladys knew Eliud and Jose Antonio as co-workers of Omar's.
At the time, their reputation was that they were MS-13 gang members from El Salvador.
Detectives head to Vaughn's to talk with Jose Antonio and Eliud's co-workers.
Employees did tell me that Omar was the supervisor for the Salvadorians, and it appeared that they didn't like Omar, they didn't like taking orders from him.
Investigators learn that Omar had been promoted to a management position a few months before his murder, and that there was constant friction between him and Eliud.
Eliud and Omar did not get along. In fact, there had actually been an incident between the two of them where Eliud had been sent home for not doing his job properly.
Eliud became so upset that he contacted the union and made a formal complaint against Omar.
Did Eliud take matters into his own hands with deadly consequences? There's one more detail about him that raises suspicions.
Eliud drove a red sedan, and it seemed to be a possible match to the car that was on the surveillance video. However, when we looked closer at the red sedan and Eliud's red sedan,
It was clear immediately that they did not match, and that was not Eliud's car in that surveillance video.
With Eliud looking less likely as the killer, investigators turned their focus to his cousin, Jose Antonio.
He claimed to have some association to some gangs. We subsequently served a search warrant at his residence. We did find assault weapons, although they ended up being imitation airsoft type weapons, so obviously they weren't involved in the actual murder itself.
We didn't find any definitive ties to Salvadorian gangs. I think it was just their bravado, and they had a heavy reputation, and they knew people were afraid of them.
Without anything concrete linking Jose Antonio or Eliud to Omar's death, detectives are forced to move on.
That was just super frustrating. It just seemed like at every corner there was something that we thought was going to really point us in the right direction and really break the case open for us, and it just was another dead end.
Just as the case threatens to hit a wall, investigators scouring Omar's cell phone activity make a jaw-dropping discovery.
In combing through thousands and thousands of text messages, we did find many text messages where he and Rosalinda spoke to each other, and it became very clear that the rumors of the affair were definitely true. It also became apparent that not only was there an affair with Rosalinda, but that Gladys knew about the affair.
That was a cause for concern because initially the affair was denied by all parties at first when the investigation began.
The texts force investigators to rethink everything. Why did Gladys and Rosalinda lie? Were either of them trying to cover up for a crime? And had Saul learned the truth and done the unthinkable?
There was a lot of evidence that showed that there were enough emotional ties involved in that somebody could be angry enough to kill someone based off of that infidelity.
Weeks have passed since father of two, Omar Hernandez, was brutally gunned down. Detectives have just obtained proof a rumored affair between Omar and coworker Rosalinda did actually take place.
Omar was involved romantically with Rosalinda, and through cell phone forensics, we located text messages that definitely confirmed that Omar had a conversation with Gladys as well about the affair that confirmed that she knew about it.
Gladys had previously told police there was nothing to the rumored affair, so investigators had to speak to her again.
When we asked Gladys about the affair, she broke down crying, and she confirmed the rumors to be true.
Gladys described how she found out about the affair with Rosalinda back in 2014. She had returned home early from a trip to Mexico, and when she came back to their house, Omar wasn't there, but there was burned wax and rose petals on the bed, on the floor around it, and she knew they weren't for her. So a couple days after, she ended up going through her husband's phone and found the text messages between Omar and Rosalinda, which confirmed to her that he had had an affair.
Detectives asked Gladys why she lied to them before. What was she trying to hide?
Her reasoning behind lying about the affair was simply to protect Omar's reputation. He had a good reputation, and she wanted to maintain that. And also, according to Gladys, they were working through their problems to keep their family together.
She just didn't want to have anything negative to say about her husband. He'd been brutally murdered. She kind of wanted to leave it at that. Let's investigate and try to figure out the person responsible.
Police are also curious why Rosalinda had been untruthful and bring her into the station.
And told her we knew that she did have an affair with Omar. She told us that she lied because she was embarrassed about it, but also that she didn't want to inflame things with Saul.
We asked her whether he knew about the affair or not. She confirmed that he did know about it. She was definitely concerned about her husband.
I asked her flat out if she believed that Saul may have killed Omar, and her answer to my question was, I don't believe he pulled the trigger. So of course that was alarming. I thought maybe I missed something at the beginning and that there was a potential that Saul may have actually even hired someone to kill Omar. It presents difficulty because then you have to backtrack and look at the initial suspect once again and make sure you haven't overlooked anything.
Investigators re-look at Saul, but after combing through phone records and text, find no evidence he hired anyone to kill Omar, or that he committed the crime himself.
At this point, the evidence did not bear fruit that Saul was the suspect we were looking for. His alibi checked out. There was nothing else that ever came up that pointed him as being the one who did this.
Saul is cleared once again. With yet another busted lead and no arrest in sight, police have to contend with the fear that's gripping Mammoth Lakes.
It was pretty hard for the community to have all these investigations going on and talk of murder and gossip of violence and the things that led to it, but no answers, just dead ends. I think people genuinely were fearing for their lives because the killer was still out there.
Afectó a la comunidad porque todos vivían en pánico, porque todos se preguntaban ¿por qué pasó esto? ¿Por qué en un pueblo tan chico, donde nunca había pasado nada así? No había explicación y pienso que la gente sí tuvo miedo.
Despite months of tireless work, investigators run out of leads.
The case essentially went cold. There was nothing to indicate any one person was responsible.
At this point, we're well over a year into the investigation, and the question starts to creep in of, is this one that may never be solved? It starts to weigh on you because we've formed relationships with Gladys, and we want nothing more than to bring justice for her family.
It definitely wears on you as an investigator. You constantly ask yourself, what did I miss? There's got to be something there that I missed.
Fue uno de los puntos más difíciles para mí también. Pero siempre tuve fe de que algún día, dije, así pasen años, se va a solucionar porque no puede quedar la muerte de Omar impune. De esta manera como él murió, no puede quedar así.
We had always been feeling that if we could just get that one piece of information that could lead us to the suspect, we'll develop the rest. But we needed somebody to come forward and give us a break that we needed to solve that case.
2.5 years later, detectives receive just that. An explosive phone call that upends the whole case.
In June 2019, a person called and said that they know who killed Omar and has some concerns for their own safety.
In my mind, I felt that that's the big break that we needed. Sometimes that's all it is, one person with information. I knew right then it was huge.
2.5 years since the brutal slaying of Omar Hernandez, an informant has come forward with information that blows the case wide open.
A man by the name of Francisco Ramirez came into our office, and you could tell that something was scaring him. He said that he was in fear for his life, for what he was going to tell us. Francisco started telling us about this individual. His name was Josue Correas Vasquez, and he was a co-worker at Vaughn's. They both worked the night shift.
Francisco worked with Josue, and Josue was actually the brother to Eliud, and he describes this contentious relationship between Omar and Eliud and Josue. Months before the murder, says that they were constantly butting heads with one another, described Eliud and Josue as constantly disrespecting Omar. Omar would delegate tasks that need to be completed, and Eliud and Josue would always be disrespectful and say, well, why do we got to do that? Nah, I don't think so. Was just constantly kind of challenging him.
Josue had actually told Francisco that he hated Omar because he had been disrespected and that he had threatened to fire his whole family, and that he had to take matters into his own hands. Then, Just several hours after the murder had occurred, Francisco told us that he received a text message from Josue, and it said something to the effect of, "See, I'm not playing around." And then there was another text message that said, "Nobody messes with me."
When he saw the text message, he felt very strongly that that is Josue's way of telling him he just murdered Omar.
Francisco then divulges another disturbing piece of information.
Francisco told us that he had actually gone shooting with Josue months prior to the murder. They had gone out in the middle of the forest, and that Josue had brought an AK-47 with him and were just shooting targets. When Francisco mentioned AK-47, obviously all of our ears perked up, as that's the weapon we were looking for.
And then several years after Omar was murdered, Francisco became the manager to take Omar's place at Bonds. And he's now in a position to where he needs to delegate, and he's now seeing the same disrespectful tone from Josue. At some point in time, he and Josue got into an argument, and Josue says something to the effect of, "Don't make me do to you what I did to Omar."
We asked Francisco why he is now just coming forward 2.5 years after the murder. And Francisco said that he was scared of Josue.
He was concerned for his safety, and he wanted to tell law enforcement about what he knew, because he said, if something is to happen to me, I want you guys to know who's responsible.
Francisco realized, I could be the one that's next, and this guy needs to be stopped.
Detectives contact Gladys to gather more information about the working relationship between Omar and Josue.
Gladys did tell us that when Josue first came to the States, he didn't have a lot of friends, he didn't know very many people, and Omar had taken Josue under his wing.
Omar was kind to him, would bring him food for lunch breaks, really seemed to keep an eye on Josue and care about his well-being.
Siempre le ponía su lunch para que él comiera en Bonds y siempre me decía, oye Gladys, échale más lunch para convivir, para darle a Josue.
Omar and Josue seemed to get along for many months during that time period. But Gladys told us that once Omar was promoted to supervisor, things started to change between Omar and Josue.
Cuando a Omar le dan el puesto, sí sentía que algo había cambiado. La misma relación de amistad ya no era igual.
Omar had a job to do, and as Omar started giving more direction and instructions to Josue, Josue started to be a bit more belligerent towards him, talking back, refusing to do certain things.
There had been reported conflicts between the two, and that Josue had felt like Omar was on a power trip.
They didn't get along at work. They were constantly arguing with one another.
Could a workplace conflict have turned into murder? Investigators pull the employee timesheets for the night Omar was killed.
We went back through the Vaughn's records from that night to see when people clocked in, and we noticed that Josue did not work at all that night. We also looked into what vehicle does Josue drive.
Detectives are hopeful that Josue's car will be a match to one of the two vehicles spotted in the surveillance footage.
We determined that at the time of the murder in 2016, he did in fact own a 2012 silver Toyota Camry. That vehicle, shortly after the murder, had been resold to another individual. So we ended up finding that vehicle down in another part of California, and it was the same vehicle that we'd seen in the video surveillance.
It matched the color and the make and model of what we were looking for.
At that moment, we felt that we had the person responsible for the murder of Omar.
Needing hard evidence to tie Josue to the murder, detectives head to the area where Francisco had witnessed him firing an AK-47.
It wasn't a designated shooting range. It was a dirt road off of a main highway.
We went out to the range where he said that he shot with Josue, and we were actually able to recover 56 cartridges that were just below the dirt. All of these cartridges were extremely important because, as we've grabbed the first cartridge we saw. It had the same head stamp of the cartridges found at the murder scene. When we found shell casings, it just really hit you in the gut.
We thought, wow, this is the first break that we've had.
2.5 years after Omar Hernandez was murdered, investigators hope they finally got a break after discovering spent bullet casings that appear to match those recovered from the crime scene.
We found north of 50 expended projectiles in the dirt and sent those casings back to the laboratory for comparison.
After we compared the two casings together, one from the murder scene and one from the shooting range, the lab told us that they were fired from the same gun.
This is huge in an investigation. We have an identified suspect and we have physical evidence.
On January 30th, 2020, Josue Correa Vasquez is arrested for Omar's murder.
After Josue was arrested, we brought him in for an interview. We knew that the shell casings recovered at the crime scene were the same as the shooting range. What we didn't have was a way to tie that in to Josue. So what we decided to do was create a fake DNA profile that would be shown to Josue, and what it said was that we recovered DNA from the shell casings and that it matched somebody of the same age and ethnicity as Josue. The goal of having the DNA profile was in hopes that it would push Josue to tell the truth.
Detectives also use another tactic and make an emotional appeal.
Investigator Callahan actually had a photograph of Omar's children on his desk.
I showed him the kids and I said, these kids, they don't deserve what happened to them. Let's try to give them some closure.
They have no father. They just want answers. They want to know.
Josue stuns investigators with what he says next.
There was a lot of hate against Ibarra from my part, and that's why me alone decided to kill him.
It was a monumental moment that we felt, okay, we've got the right guy.
The question remains, why would Josue commit such a heinous crime?
Josue told us he hated Omar. He hated that he would tell him how to do his job. He hated that he'd be tough on him.
He felt that he was disrespected by Omar, and he was there to teach Omar a lesson.
Josue proceeds to tell investigators what happened that fatal night.
You knew that Omar was going to work at 2 in the morning?
He said that he drove by Omar's residence a number of times, confirmed that the vehicle in the video surveillance was in fact his vehicle.
He says he went around the block to see if he was home.
Just before 2 a.m., Josue parked across the street from Omar's home, and he waited for him to come out.
He saw Omar come out of his residence, and that was the moment that he'd been waiting for. He grabbed the AK-47 when Omar went to the driver's side of the door to leave. Josue emerged from the trees and yelled at him, "You don't look so invincible now, do you?" and described shooting him several times. He described the look in Omar's face, the surprise, the shock.
How many times did you shoot?
Era mucho el odio, le disparé todo el cartucho. Como el tercer disparo ya cayó. ¿Y seguiste disparando? Sí. He kept firing.
Josue said that after he murdered Omar, he went home, he went to bed. A lot of Josue's interview is matter of fact, which was chilling in and of itself, that you can have murdered somebody and just be talking about it in such an unemotional way.
Josue admits that several days after killing Omar, he told his brother Elliot what he had done.
Eliud was concerned about the murder weapon and whether it could be traced back to Josue. So Eliud took it upon himself to take the AK-47 to the forest and bury it so no one would ever be able to find it.
Based on Josue's confession, police bring in Eliud.
He eventually admitted to us that he did help dispose of the gun and gave us the details about where it was, and he pointed to the exact location where the firearm would be recovered.
So we dug right there and sure enough found an AK-47.
At this point, it's kind of a prosecutor's dream. We have a confession, statement from the defendant, and the murder weapon that we never thought we would recover just showed up.
For his part in the crime, Eliud is sentenced to a year in jail.
Eliud was charged as being an accessory after the fact. He was charged for helping dispose of the murder weapon and not telling authorities about it.
On January 18th, 2022, Josue is sentenced to 2 life terms in prison for the murder of Omar Hernandez.
El día de la sentencia sentí paz porque se estaba haciendo justicia de la muerte de Omar. Nunca imaginé que Josué hubiera hecho eso. Tan desgarrador, algo tan triste.
The biggest surprise was that it was somebody that you just never really would have expected. Omar had taken Josue under his wing. By all accounts, Omar cared very much about Josue.
That's what was so troubling in this case. Omar lost his life, was brutally murdered for no reason other than he was a hard-working individual who had expectations.
A mis hijos les quitó un padre y a mí la mitad de mi corazón. Eso nos arrancó Josué.
Omar's family still feels the deep impact of his loss.
Sé que desde el cielo Él me da esas fuerzas. Yo que lo recuerdo mucho en el momento donde yo necesito recargar mi cabeza en su hombro, donde ocupo el abrazo que me diga, todo va a estar bien, Gladys, no te preocupes, y que me haga así. Esos momentos extraño mucho de él.
Ambitious, popular young restaurant manager.
She was a tremendous young person who had unlimited potential. We always thought she'd just light the world on fire.
Is found beaten, stabbed, and suffocated.
The person who did this absolutely wanted to guarantee that she was dead.
Whoever did it ransacked the safe. Something that brutal had to be more than just a robbery.
Detectives uncover a history of workplace conflict.
He didn't like to be told what to do.
He scared me. I was uncomfortable around him. For me, that was a red flag.
With the community on edge, another attack leaves them living in fear.
It was such a similar homicide, a lone female employee and the use of a knife.
You don't know if somebody's lurking out there and they're going to do it again.
And new evidence confirms disturbing suspicions.
The lab informed me that there was a match.
I just couldn't believe what was happening. Like, when am I going to wake up?
Terry's murder wasn't what it appeared to be.
Falls Township, Pennsylvania is a family-friendly suburb with blue-collar roots.
Falls Township is a community in Lower Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It was built up around the U.S. Steel Mill in the 1950s.
Steel workers moved out here from different parts of the country, and it was a nice community.
Although we're a suburb of Philadelphia and we're right across the river from Trenton, violent crime is relatively unusual in Falls.
That all changes one Saturday morning with a gruesome discovery at a fast food restaurant.
On the morning of February 4th, 1984, the manager arrived to open the restaurant, and upon entering, discovered that someone was laying outside the kitchen area and obviously deceased.
The manager recognizes the woman as the restaurant's night shift manager, 25-year-old Terry Brooks.
He observed Terry Brooks laying on the floor in a pool of blood with a knife stuck in her neck. And he phoned the dispatcher and stayed on the phone until officers got there. I was told that they had a homicide at the Roy Rogers restaurant on Route 1, so I was there pretty quickly. Her body was positioned near the kitchen. There was a butcher knife sticking out of her neck. She had black and blue marks and bruises everywhere, and it looked like hand marks around her neck, like she had been strangled. It was thought that she was still alive until the bag was put over her head because of the moisture in it from her breath. She looked like she had blood under her fingernails and blood on her hand, and that was wrapped in an evidence bag and secured.
There was a rectangular kitchen prep area. That's where you could see both her shoes that were against the wall. To my mind, that was probably the first act of violence that took place. That she was literally pushed right out of her shoes, and that a struggle had taken place right there. Moving around the corner is where the body was found.
It looked like her body had been dragged on the floor to where she laid. Terry had her winter coat on, and her bag was also on the floor, like she was getting ready to leave.
Further examination of the scene reveals evidence of another crime.
In the office, the safe was open. There was a register drawer on the desk.
The coins were scattered all over the floor. It just appeared that whoever did it ransacked the safe.
There was money taken. It had all the earmarkings of a robbery homicide. It was fairly easy for the restaurant to get a count of what was missing, and it was around $2,500.
Looking for more clues, detectives speak to the manager who discovered Terry's body.
When the manager of the restaurant arrived around 6 in the morning, he found the inner vestibule door locked.
The door to the interior of the building was locked, but the drive-through window was partially open.
It appeared that the killer had left through the drive-through window, because the metal pipe that was laid in the track as the kind of security measure to lock it up had been removed and laid to the side. But there was no sign of forced entry in the restaurant.
Police believe Terry was killed sometime after midnight when the restaurant had closed. As detectives continue to process the crime scene, Terry's family discovers that she never returned home from work.
The morning of the murder, Scott, the victim's fiance, knocks on the door to the Brooks family home. At the time, Terry lived with her parents.
We hear a banging at the door, and it was Scott standing there, and he's like, Terry's car's not in the driveway.
He tells them that he was driving by their house on his way to work, and that he noticed Terry's car wasn't there. They then looked in her room and saw that, in fact, she wasn't home. And then Scott picked up the phone and dialed to Roy Rogers.
And he goes, this is George Brooks, Terry Brooks' father. You know, she didn't come home last night. Is she okay? And they said, no, she's not. She, has been murdered. I was kind of shocked they told him over the phone, but I just couldn't believe what was happening. Like, when am I going to wake up? It's a horrible thing.
I was getting ready to go to work when my phone rang. I was getting a call from her stepmother to tell me so that I wouldn't see it on the news, and my heart just sunk.
Terry Brooks grew up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, the oldest of 4 children.
My mom and dad divorced. Terry was in 8th grade, and she kind of took over the mother role after that happened. Out of all of us, she was probably the most ambitious. We always thought, Terry would have her own business one day, and she'd just light the world on fire.
Terry took jobs in the restaurant industry and earned a reputation as a hard worker.
I worked with Terry at an Italian restaurant. In the beginning, she was a server. I tended bar. She became management after working there for a while. She really, really took pride in her work and how she dealt with people.
Soon after her promotion, she began a year-long romance with her coworker, Scott Keith.
She met Scott at the restaurant. He was the head chef. They had a good time together.
Terry just came home one day with a ring on her finger, and we were all like, oh my God.
While Terry planned her dream wedding for the upcoming summer, her career also started to take off.
It was her dream to move forward to bigger things in the hotel business. And she had looked into getting a job with the Marriott Corporation.
The position she accepted with the Marriott was to be a manager of Roy Rogers restaurant.
I first met Terry when I started working at the Roy Rogers. She was my boss. She was always happy. She was very excited about her wedding, and she was excited to go dress shopping.
I know she put the down payment on the honeymoon to Hawaii, and she was talking about the bridesmaid dresses.
Terry and Scott were apartment hunting. There was a lot to do. It was at a time when all new things were happening in her life.
Now, detectives must determine who could have killed this ambitious young woman just a few months before her wedding. They asked the family about Terry's movements in the hours leading up to her murder.
Mr. and Mrs. Brooks last saw Terry the day before, Friday, February 3rd, 1984, when she left for work.
Usually, her fiancé, Scott, would make sure that he went and closed with her every night. And her father was glad that Scott would go and close with her and be there to keep her safe.
Scott was worried about Terry's security at the restaurant. He would go and sit with her while she finished everything up.
Scott tells police he wasn't with Terry the night before. He had stayed home because he was working the early shift the following morning. Neither Scott nor Terry's parents are able to provide police with any leads.
The family was really cooperative with the investigation, and we just nothing that they could volunteer or give us that would indicate that they knew anything about the case.
It was completely out of the blue. There was no reason for them to feel that she was in any danger or in any jeopardy.
I couldn't think of anybody who really disliked Terry, and I can't imagine anybody would dislike her that much to kill her.
Investigators turned their attention to Terry's coworkers.
It looked like it could possibly be a robbery, but the deeper we looked into to see how brutally she was murdered, it had to be more than just a robbery.
Detectives want to know how Terry was thought of by her colleagues.
Terry was a young woman who was very staunch about the procedures, and she enforced them strictly.
She was a by-the-book person, and as long as you did your work the way you were supposed to, there were no problems.
When police ask if Terry's management style made her any enemies, one name keeps coming up.
Steve Daly was an employee that didn't adhere to the procedures. He was a little hot-headed.
Steve scared me, to be honest. He was very rough, quick to anger. I was uncomfortable around him.
Detectives learned that just weeks before the murder, the tension between Terry and Steve hit a breaking point.
He ended up getting fired, and wasn't too happy about it.
You've got this former employee who had a clear animus towards the victim and is fired by the victim. And add to that here's an employee who knows how the restaurant operates, who knows the security procedures. He's got the kind of knowledge to be able to commit this crime. So this is somebody who now rises to the top of the list.
Coming up, police zero in on a suspect.
Fingerprints were found on one of the murder weapons.
At that point, he admitted he took the money from the office.
But conflicting statements frustrate detectives.
It was completely a misdirection, a diversion.
How could somebody do this and get away with it?
Until the investigation takes a jaw-dropping turn.
The polygraph operator said he was lying.
It caught me by surprise.
I remember him all of a sudden blowing up.
It was the turning point in the investigation.
Police investigating the fatal stabbing of 25-year-old restaurant manager Terry Brooks have learned that a disgruntled coworker lashed out at Terry before he was fired.
If you threaten somebody and they end up dead, you'd have to look at them and look at them seriously.
Steve Daly was a former Marine and had a difficult personality. He didn't like to be told what to do.
Just weeks before the murder, Terry and Steve had a major blowout.
There was an occasion at work where Steve Daly was told to make a hamburger for a customer, and he had just closed out that workspace, so he didn't want to reopen the workspace.
And I remember him all of a sudden blowing up. Steve lost his temper, was screaming and yelling.
He became explosive, at one point even calling Terry a bitch. Terry was alarmed by Daly's behavior.
Terry, in a situation like what happened with Steve, she wouldn't tolerate it.
She didn't waver. So I think that was the frustrating thing for Steve, is he couldn't break her.
And she was like, you need to go home, you are done for the night, and you will talk to the boss the next morning.
Daly storms out of the restaurant, and the next day Terry talks to her manager, tells him what had happened, which of course led to Daly being fired.
That did little to stop Steve's aggressive behavior.
Even after he was fired, Daly would return to the restaurant and buy food and have meals there.
He went back just to annoy her, just, here I am, you can't throw me out now. It was very upsetting to her.
So, given his personality and his conduct, that certainly seems to provide a motive.
Did Steve Daly's harassment escalate into a fatal act of revenge? Police bring him in for an interview.
When we tracked Daly down, one of the first things he tells us that he knew at some point the police would be coming to talk to him. Daly said that he didn't get along with Terry, that they clashed often. In fact, he said that if she'd been a man, he would have punched her. Daly's excuse for why he was going back to the restaurant was that he was dating somebody who worked there. I don't know that I buy that, but that's the reason he gave.
Investigators ask where Steve was the night of the murder.
He says that he was trying to get into a club, and that he was not permitted access to the club, so then he just drove around for several hours. Investigators go to the club, they look at the security footage. They can't find any footage of Daly being denied entry, so this is not a hard alibi that can allow you to say, okay, this person's eliminated. Just the opposite.
With no way to prove his whereabouts when Terry was killed, police ask Steve to take a polygraph.
So a polygraph is a useful investigative tool. It can help us rule people in or out. So Daly agrees to take the polygraph, and without question, he passed. This guy looks like a good suspect. So when you have momentum build like that, and then it crashes to a halt, it's hard to swallow.
Police can't verify Steve's alibi, but with no evidence against him, he's free to go.
Stephen Daly was pushed down lower on the list of suspects, but you never eliminate somebody until you make sure that they are completely not involved.
Investigators turn their focus on the Roy Rogers staff who worked with Terry the night of the murder.
During the investigation, we knew that we had to interview the employees to see what the atmosphere was when they left, if there was any arguments. Everybody consented to have their fingerprints taken.
The evening that Terry was murdered, there were 4 employees that she was working with: Patricia, Ron, Barb, and Dan. And each of those employees was identified and interviewed separately.
Patricia tells investigators that just before closing, Terry discovered that money had gone missing from Barb's cash register.
The employees got in an argument, and there was $40 that was supposedly missing.
Terry was going to get to the bottom of this. It wasn't a minor event. She took it very seriously. She began questioning different employees. Where did it go? Why is it missing?
Terry played everything by the book. If there's any money missing, and you are caught being the person that's been hitting the till, there's no tolerance for stealing.
Terry cared about her employees, but some people didn't like her because she could be tough when she needed to be tough.
Patricia indicated that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. If you're stealing money from Roy Rogers and you're an employee there, that's a fireable offense. So did this provide a motive for murder?
As Terry attempted to unmask the thief, the employees began to point fingers.
Barb told Terry that she thought Ron did it. So he's now being confronted with the idea that he took this money, and he actually turned his pockets inside out to prove, hey, he didn't have any cash on him.
Could Ron have killed Terry in a rage after being accused of stealing? As detectives look closer at Ron, fingerprint analysis provides crucial new evidence.
The employees who worked that night clean up before they close.
Working the later shift, you had to clean up everything, wash all the equipment, sweep them out the floors, wipe down all the tables, stuff like that.
So I thought that whoever was in there after closing could have possibly left fingerprints.
We began matching up fingerprints that they'd lifted from different services to elimination prints taken from different employees. And it was discovered that Ron's fingerprints were found on the drive-through window and on the trash bag that was wrapped around Terry's face. Here we go. This is somebody that we need to look at.
Investigators working to solve the Terry Brooks homicide have just got a match for fingerprints left at the crime scene.
The evening that Terry was murdered, there were 4 employees that she was working with, including an employee named Ron, and Ron's fingerprints were found on the drive-through window and on the trash bag that was wrapped around Terry's face.
Detectives ask Ron how his fingerprints ended up on the bag used to suffocate Terry and on the drive-through window, the killer's likely escape route.
Ron said that one of his responsibilities at the restaurant was to take care of the trash, so his fingerprints would have been on that bag because that was part of his job there. Ron also said that he'd covered for some other employees for their break time at the drive-thru, so that's why his print was there in the window.
Police aren't able to determine if the window had been properly cleaned at closing, so Ron's excuse is plausible. Still, detectives want to know his whereabouts after he left work.
Ron said that he left the restaurant shortly after 1 in the morning with coworkers, and that he got home about 1:15 and talked to his mom before he went to bed. We checked out Ron's alibi, discovered that he had indeed gotten home and stayed home all night.
With Ron all but cleared, police get new details from another employee about the money that had gone missing from Barb's cash register.
We learned the $40 that was supposedly missing, it was found at a later time.
The missing money had mysteriously reappeared in the drop safe.
I think it's fair to say that Terry might have thought that it was Barb who had taken this money. My impression was that Terry was suspicious of Barb.
Police also learned that it was Barb's duty to close down the drive-thru.
Those two things combined, the missing $40 and the fact that it was Barb's responsibility to lock that drive-thru window, and that ultimately it's found unlocked, and it's believed to be where the killer left, puts her at the top of the suspect list.
According to the work schedule, Barb and Terry were the last 2 employees at the restaurant.
The policy of Roy Rogers for employees that were going to work past the end of their shift was that they would lock the doors and that there would be a minimum of 2 employees there.
Could an argument between Terry and Barb over the missing money have turned deadly?
Barb said that she was sent home early by Terry, and she was insistent that she close the window and place the pipe in the track to lock. And in looking into Barb's whereabouts, we discovered that she was picked up by her boyfriend, so she had an alibi. So it's conceivable that Terry was alone in the restaurant, working into the early hours of February 4th doing inventory.
Police later confirmed the alibis of every employee who worked the night of the murder. When the autopsy report arrives, investigators hope it will give them a new lead.
The pathologist found that Terry had been strangled, and the bone in the back of her neck was severed from the stab wound.
There was a serious brain hemorrhage that was the result of her head being repeatedly banged against that hard concrete floor. And looking at that stab wound to her spine, it was likely she was conscious but paralyzed when the plastic trash bag was wrapped around her head.
The autopsy report lists each of Terry's severe injuries as potentially fatal, but indicates asphyxiation as the likely cause of death.
There was no indication that Terry had been sexually assaulted. You can't help but look at the way that Terry was killed and not think that the person who did this had such a high level of rage that they absolutely wanted to guarantee that she was dead. Material was collected from the knife that was left lodged in Terry's throat and under Terry's right ring finger, where the pathologist had identified a defensive wound. At the time of this murder in 1984, there was no DNA technology. Analysis of blood was really relegated to blood typing. By today's standards, the evidence was limited.
As the investigation continues, Terry's loved ones struggle to make sense of her violent death.
The funeral home called the morning of the viewing, and they said, could somebody come down and take a look at Terry? And they had her laid out in the casket, and she didn't look good. You could see the cut marks in her neck, and you could see the bruises on the back of her hand, and they had makeup on her too, and you could still see it didn't look like Terry. I said when I got home to my dad, I think we should keep the casket closed. We didn't want people to remember her looking like that.
As the Brooks family prepares to bury their eldest daughter, Falls Township lives in fear of a brutal killer still at large.
It was a young person that was killed, at her job. So I think the community as a whole regarded this as a frightening homicide.
It caused quite a bit of fear due to the fact that it was so violent, and most people in this area would think this shouldn't happen in our town.
I really thought it probably was, a robbery. Unfortunately, they killed her instead of just robbing the place. But you don't know if somebody's lurking out there, and they're going to do it again.
Less than 2 weeks after Terry's murder, the town's worst fear appears to become a horrifying reality.
At another Roy Rogers, an assistant manager was attacked coming out of the bathroom. She was hit in the head. She fell to the floor, and the actor ran away before she could identify him.
The restaurant manager survives. But just a week later in nearby Scranton, there's another brutal attack.
A male attacker waited in the parking lot until there was a lone female employee, then made entry into the restaurant. But the money from the restaurant had already been dropped into the safe, so he took the female employee's money and then stabbed her to death.
Detectives fear they have a serial killer on the loose.
And when you take a community that was already stressed, it made it even worse. And if you've got an individual who's going from restaurant to restaurant and just robbing people, and they have no personal connection to the victim, it's terrifying. It took it up a notch.
3 weeks after the murder of Terry Brooks, police have learned another restaurant employee has been stabbed to death in nearby Scranton.
Scranton's just up the turnpike, and it's not really that far from us. So anything that would indicate a violent armed robbery, we would have to look into.
It was such a similar homicide, a lone female employee inside a restaurant, a male attacker, and the use of a knife.
Investigators learn that a suspect has already been arrested. Could he also be Terry Brooks' killer?
The person that committed this homicide in Scranton was a man named Steve Duffy. We sent investigators to go to Scranton to attempt to interview Duffy, and by the time we arrive, he has lawyered up. But we got a warrant to obtain his fingerprints and compare them to the fingerprints from the scene. But in the end, the fingerprint comparison indicated no connection to the homicide at our Roy Rogers.
Police are also unable to identify a suspect in the assault of the manager at the other Roy Rogers location.
You go through this cycle of building momentum, and then you hit a wall. It's disheartening.
It's been a month since Terry Brooks was found dead, and the killer is still at large.
Something that brutal and that terrifying, you have to try to solve it, no matter how long it takes. But when the leads start running out, you get awful upset.
As weeks turn to months, and you identify suspects and then eliminate them over and over again, the case went cold. An investigator, by necessity, has to move on to other cases. But for a family that loses a loved one to a homicide, they don't move on.
When it first happened, you just assumed it was going to be solved. You think, well, how could somebody do this and get away with it? My dad's hair turned white within a year. He lost weight. It just destroyed him.
It was hard for Terry's family, having to process the heartache of losing their daughter and not having closure over it. I couldn't imagine not having answers.
There are no significant developments in the investigation for nearly 14 years. Then, in 1998, Falls Township's new police chief orders a fresh look at the Terry Brooks murder, and a local prosecutor is assigned to the case.
One of the primary reasons that the police chief put this renewed focus on this case was that there had been developments in DNA technology during the 1990s. And part of the point of my assignment to have someone come in with a fresh point of view, it was just a matter of reviewing all of those reports and reviewing all the physical evidence. It caught me by surprise a bit when I opened up the bag that contained Terry's wallet. I found that you could still clearly smell Terry's perfume. And because I wasn't expecting it, it's one of those things that sort of triggers your emotions and brings you closer to the victim.
A team is assembled for the renewed investigation.
Lori said, take a look at this homicide. And she asked me what I thought, and apparently my answers were well enough to get me assigned to work on it.
At the time that the homicide occurred, other robberies at fast food restaurants in the area caused law enforcement to form the initial theory that it was likely to have been a robbery.
We had the advantage of knowing that the robbery-homicide track didn't work out, so we could start with a different theory. There were two things that really jumped out. One, that we could conduct victimology interviews and talk to some people who weren't interviewed back at the time. And two, develop some kind of forensic signature for the killer.
As the lab works to extract the killer's DNA from crime scene evidence, investigators learn more about the victim, Terry Brooks.
Victimology essentially means learning everything you possibly can about the victim. Everybody who we spoke to described Terry Brooks as intelligent, ambitious, friendly, well-loved by her family and friends. Detective Whitney spent a lot of time with the family to gain their trust and to reassure them that we were working on the case diligently. Nelson and Lori did seem like the power couple. Both of them are extremely intelligent, and they were driven to get this solved.
Detectives hope new interviews will bring to light crucial details that could help the case.
You just never know when you're going to get some new piece of information that's going to put us on a track to identify who did this.
Some of the people who we spoke to, they were quite young when this homicide occurred, in their late teens or early 20s, and having more life experience were a bit more open than they might have felt they could be in the 1980s.
Detectives reach out to people who weren't interviewed in the 1984 investigation, including those who worked with Terry before her employment at Roy Rogers.
I got a call from Falls Township Police. They wanted to speak to me about the Terry Brooks murder, and they just said to me, we'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Cindy knew Terry well. They worked together, and Cindy kind of laid out what was going on in the victim's life.
During her interview with investigators, Cindy drops a bombshell.
What Cindy told us presented a completely different image of this homicide. It turned out Terry's murder wasn't what it appeared to be. And now you couldn't help but conclude everything's pointing to one person.
"14 years after the murder of Terry Brooks, cold case investigators have just received shocking new information from a friend and former coworker of Terry's.
We asked what things did Terry share with, Cindy as a friend.
And I said to them, Terry and her fiancé Scott, their upcoming wedding, at first was exciting for Terry. But I proceeded to tell them that the week before Terry had been murdered, she wanted to call off the wedding. She just realized that's not what she wanted.
We knew Terry and Scott had just put down a deposit on their honeymoon, and their wedding was upcoming. And in the initial investigation, the officers that conducted it came away with the impression that they were a happy couple.
There hadn't really been anything in the reports that indicated there were any problems in Terry Brooks's relationship with Scott Keefe. But we did learn that Terry confided to some of her friends
that she wasn't entirely sure she was going to go through with getting married.
Mr. and Mrs. Brooks felt close to Scott. He was the young man that was going to marry their daughter. To her parents, Scott was this loving, caring fiancé who would check on Terry and drive by to make sure she was, safe and give her rides.
Some of Terry's friends had a very different impression of Scott.
Cindy Bradney told us that there had been some problems in the relationship. For me, that was a red flag.
I think 3 times in her changing jobs and the fact that she was moving on and going for her dream and he was stuck where he was, his jealousy became an issue and he was very possessive. Scott would not let Terry stay alone. She was afraid to tell him she didn't want to be married. She was afraid to call it off. She didn't know what she was going to do, to the point where she was in tears.
Police get further insight into Terry and Scott's relationship from Terry's siblings.
When she started dating Scott, we just were all scratching our heads, like, what is she doing with him? He was just not the kind of guy she always dated. He wasn't fun-loving. All he wanted to do was sit there and drink. And that was just unlike her. It just seemed like he wanted to keep us away from her and him. It just makes you think back, like maybe he did have signs of an abusive person. But at the time, I just really thought it was a robbery, and she was killed during the robbery.
Detectives have a new perspective on Scott and how the supposedly grieving fiancé might have avoided suspicion at the time of Terry's death.
My dad thought Scott really loved Terry. He thought if she loved him, I'll love him too.
Mr. Brooks was a very kind man, and in fact, George bought Scott the suit that he wore to Terry's funeral.
Her father just had such a big heart that I don't think he believed that someone that his daughter fell in love with could harm her. And I believe Scott played on that.
Scott becomes someone that we think may have done this. Examining the crime scene through the lens of, what if Scott did this? Okay, that's how he got in. She let him in. We were told that he had a practice of going to the restaurant and sitting with her while she worked after hours. And it's personal, it's rage, and then the action of placing that bag over her face to kind of depersonalize her is a telltale mark of what someone does when they've killed somebody that they're close to. And now it becomes a priority for us to see if the forensic track, if the evidence points that way.
Investigators hope the killer's DNA can be extracted from the crime scene evidence collected back in 1984.
It was a potential concern that they might not be able to find any usable DNA due to the amount of time that had gone by.
Luckily, the knife that was left lodged in Terry's throat and the material collected from under Terry's right ring finger, where the pathologist had identified a defensive wound to that area, yielded an unknown male DNA profile.
It was highly unlikely under the circumstances that DNA material would have come from anyone other than the perpetrator. The next thing we had to do was obtain a DNA sample from our suspect. Scott Keefe did not have a criminal record at that time. He didn't have any DNA samples on file with an agency such as the FBI. One of the things that we learned from the laboratory expert was that cigarette butts are an excellent potential source of DNA because they have saliva on them. And at that point, we actually knew what kind of cigarettes Keefe smoked, and we knew where he lived.
Police hatch a plan to secretly obtain a sample of Scott Keefe's DNA.
We didn't at that point want to obtain a subpoena to obtain DNA from him directly because we wanted to interview him first. We wanted to set that up in the most advantageous possible way, and we were concerned that he was a flight risk.
It was very important to us to be very careful about who knew he was a suspect and who we shared that information with. And it was also very important to us to not be caught doing surveillance. In 1998, Scott's life had kind of come full circle from where it was in 1984. In 1984, he was living at home with his parents. He had gone on to live with a girlfriend and then marry. They'd had a child together, but then they split up and got divorced, and in 1998, he was back home living with his mom.
Under Pennsylvania law, trash was considered to be abandoned property once it was put out in front of the house for collection. So Detective Whitney immediately took custody of it, took it directly to the laboratory that was doing the DNA analysis.
I knew I was going to get a definitive answer one way or the other. Could be him, could be somebody else. It was that anticipation of I'm going to get a final result here that's going to matter a great deal in this investigation.
Police investigating the 1984 murder of Terry Brooks have secretly collected a DNA sample from her fiancé, Scott Keith.
We had to obtain a DNA sample from our suspect, so we collected cigarette butts that were in the trash.
The sample is compared to DNA found on Terry's body.
I'll never forget the phone call I got where the doctor at the lab informed me that there was a match from Scott's cigarettes to the crime scene evidence.
It was the turning point in the investigation. That was the point at which we knew we would be able to prove that Scott Keith was the killer. Although we had very solid physical evidence against Keith, it's always better if you have an incriminating statement from the defendant. We asked Mr. Keith to come to the police station as one of the friends and family members that we were interviewing as part of our investigation.
We believed that he would cooperate with us. We believed that he would come across as wanting to help, that he would try to sell us the same story that he was the grieving fiancé, that he'd been telling people for 15 years.
As predicted, Scott agrees to cooperate with police.
We had a strategy to conduct that interview on the anniversary date of the murder. People pay attention to dates. It could raise a person's anxiety level and make them more apt to make mistakes.
The interview begins, and Scott tells a familiar tale.
He told us the same story that he had told others over the years, that they were happy, this was the love of his life, and that somebody else had taken her away from him. If we came on too hard, we were too aggressive in our questioning, we felt he would lawyer up and stop the interview. So slowly we built towards the question of whether Scott had anything to do with this or any knowledge of it. And once we got to that point, we asked Scott if he would take a polygraph.
You can never force anyone to undergo a polygraph examination, but he agreed to that.
The polygraph operator said he was lying. So now Scott started to say things like, I didn't mean for this to happen. But then he caught himself and said, but I didn't do it. But over time that culminated at one point in him saying, she came at me first. And that was the first time he put himself at the scene.
Investigators keep the pressure on, and finally, Scott breaks.
He admitted that she essentially told him that she wanted to break up with him, and he was enraged because of that.
At one point, he punched her in the face. They struggled for a while in that kitchen prep area. A knife had fallen onto the floor, and he knocked her down and straddled her, choking her and banging her head repeatedly against the floor. But then he grabbed the knife and stabbed her with it, and it stuck in her throat. Then, in his words, he bent over to make sure she was dead, saw that she was still breathing, so he grabbed the trash can liner to wrap around her face to make sure that she would in fact die, and he said he didn't want to look at her face.
At that point, he admitted he took the money from the office.
He said he exited to the drive-thru window to make it look like a robbery. Scott told us that the reason he went to the Brooks family home the morning of the murder was to make him look innocent. So he's surrounded by her family when the crime is supposedly discovered. It was completely completely a misdirection, a diversion that worked for 15 years for him.
Scott is charged with first-degree murder.
I was elated. I was like, thank God they finally nailed him. Because we waited a long time. Getting the answers of who killed my sister really gave my dad some comfort. But I think he was still in disbelief that Scott did it.
We were just so happy we could tell her family that the person who had killed their daughter was in prison, and we were confident he was going to be convicted.
At trial, Scott Keefe is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
Terry was a tremendous young person who had unlimited potential. She had good relationships with her family. It's really a terrible tragedy that her life ended this way.
It's just so sad that somebody so young, because of standing up for themselves and wanting to move forward in their lives, gets their life cut short.
Terry would have had a very bright future, and I'm sure she would have had a ton of kids, and we'd be hanging out right now.
Terry would love to be remembered with those big eyes, that smile, her kindness in her heart, and a person with a goal. She was truly a lovely, lovely person.